And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's fantastic to have so many people here. I've been watching the chat since you guys started, and there's already a lot of great ideas moving around. And we are on episode 27 here of the X series, and tonight is going to be absolutely fantastic. One of the most breakthrough of all the episodes, because we're going to deal with the role of Ada Lovelace and CERN and the Orphic Circle, and bring them all together with our very special guest, Gigi Young, who'll be joining us in about an hour. Right now, I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia has been on fire this week. She's been kind of a magnetic storm of ideas and images, and it's been very interesting because whenever I get around CERN, and of course CERN is the nuclear facility in Europe, which is one of the largest. It actually is the largest particle physics laboratories anywhere, and it's there in Switzerland, and it has a budget, an annual budget of over $8 billion, which is technically a military budget when you think about it. Scientific projects don't get that kind of money. And of course, in our digging around, we found out all kinds of things about CERN, which I never get tired of reiterating, such as it is a sovereign entity, which is quite unusual. On a number of different occasions, we've seen very strange things happen at CERN. Occult rituals have been filmed there, mock human sacrifices, which is very odd. You know, it's supposed to be the scientific facility. But they've invited this kind of scrutiny by their own secrecy, one, and two, the kind of unusual imagery that they have all over the place, celebrating these different gods and things, making us believe that, you know, really, if you dig a little bit deeper beyond the surface, we're looking for the Higgs boson thing, which, by the way, since they already found, that would defeat the purpose of doing any ongoing experiments. We're definitely into a whole different strata and field of what CERN is made for. Ostensibly, CERN is the largest particle collider facility in the world. But beyond that, of course, it is the host of the Large Hadron Collider. And this smashing particles thing has been going on since 1938. And the main people behind the klystron, which is the fundamental technology behind the particle acceleration, are the group, the Varian brothers, who we've shown here in this program with their deep, deep ties to the mystery schools and theosophy. So you can see what you're in for tonight, which is a deep examination of Ada Lovelace, and let's not forget her dad, Lord Byron. And it only gets more interesting from there because, of course, her good friend is Mary Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein. So when we put all those people together and we start to understand their contributions in these various fields of mathematics, of course, Ada Lovelace, as we'll find out shortly, was the you know, she's the first. She calls herself the bride of science, which I think is interesting. But she's the first person who developed a computer program, and she did it as early as 1840. So we're talking about an extraordinary life here and extraordinary contribution, and her work with the geniuses and the absolute kind of top of the line intellects of the time, as well as her royal connections. Unbelievable. A supercharged person who died very young, like her dad did at the age of 36, and was just a very complex mix of qualities. But what's fascinating, of course, is that she is so, you know, from my research, so right down the line, the perfect candidate for the Orphic Circle. And in this episode, I'm going to explain how her relations with figures like Dickens really got her into the Orphic Circle, and how most of her output is actually based on her interest in mesmerism, which is directly out of her work in the Orphic Circle as a somnambulist trance channel. So the parallels between her life and the life of Emma Britton, who we've showcased here on a number of occasions, and Emma Hardinge Britton being one of the founders of Theosophy, along with Helena Blavatsky, and who Blavatsky named as the literal best trance medium that she had ever come across. It's quite a compliment coming from Blavatsky, who'd been in mystery schools and gone to Tibet and all the rest of it. So whenever we get around Emma Britton and her work, that little echo rings for me. And of course, when you read Emma's work, you really get a feeling of what Blavatsky was pointing out. Now, before we go any further, I want to say you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is the X series, and the X series is based on X Steganography, which is something that I found popping up whenever I was looking into black projects having to do with technology, oddly enough. And, you know, this major project would go off the table and it would resurface with this X name and a new budget, or, you know, it kind of would get brushed off into that black ops world and always have a kind of a showy facade. It always had the caricature of a program on the surface in the public. But when we get into these kind of covert, overt worlds, we have to look just a little bit deeper. And so the X Steganography that kept coming up, I would find in FBI documents also dealing with the UFO file, and I would also find it with all of these different programs. And I started to realize after getting, you know, close to 200 of them as examples, that it was a way of shepherding this kind of unusual technology through these different government agencies so that certain people would know. And so it wasn't a cryptography where it was a hidden process that wasn't out in the open, something that we could kind of crack and decipher. It was actually a process that was out in the open, but you'd have to know what to look for in order to track it. And that is the kind of quality of steganography, which is the genuine term that they used in the Middle Ages for it, is a text within a text. And that's something that we need to keep in context as we go along here. So we're looking for a text within a text so that when we're looking at something, there's something deeper beneath the page. And we, you know, it's very tricky when you get into alternative research. There's so many kind of blind alleys you can go down. So I've developed a really kind of solid way to track the actual X steganography. And what they do, oddly enough, because, you know, you'd say, well, here's an unnatural X formation and pattern versus another one that seems perfectly natural. The problem is with the type and the levels of secrecy they conduct with the X steganography, you will get into both, because when you're tracking something normal, that's how they want you to see it, because it's only something that someone who knows can see it. So this is a splendid way on the government side for people to look at a program and say, for example, you know, what's happening here is I have 10,000 some odd agents and I can't brief them all on this very deep project and invite them in on that level of secrecy. It's too much of a risk. So what I'm going to do is instruct them to follow these types of designations, and the designations are X. And we've shown multiple examples in now 27 episodes of this program. So that gives you kind of an idea of the X steganography. We've also covered the fact that presidents have left this X steganography behind. And we have implications from President Eisenhower, who left behind his Project X time capsule to be opened in 2050. Nixon and his time capsule, which is has the X steganography. And, you know, also we have this LBJ letter at the LBJ library. And this is particularly interesting because this one is supposed to be opened in 2023. And so we're getting an idea that these presidents were involved in a very deep level shepherding this thing along. And it's this X technology. And to make a long story short, what I've tracked it all down to is this effect that happens. And the effect is called Apotheum. And Apotheum, spelled Apotheum, comes from Greek. And it's basically a reality distortion measure that occurs whenever you are involved with something fantastic or extraordinary. And this is where my work researching the mystery schools comes in handy, because just tracking the kind of secrecy programs around the government that use the X steganography won't cut it. As I found out, that X steganography goes all the way back to the mystery schools and pushes us back to the Egyptian Book of the Dead and, you know, the culture of Atlantis and the former advanced civilization that was back there. They all are part of this. And we try to spell it out in each show as we get into them. So that's the kind of broad picture. Now we're going to pinpoint in as we do that fantastic swing that we do from 2018 to the 19th century. And this is a very important factor for us to be able to complete that pendulum swing of information between these two decades so that we don't get caught up in just looking at it historically. As long as we have the X steganography as the guide, all of these things, whether it's theosophy, anthroposophy, their influence on politics, on home rule of places like India or Ireland, the World War II, you know, the things that are happening now with North Korea, all of these different geopolitical situations come so much more into focus when we are using the X Steganography to help us understand how the sort of guarding this Apotheum effect by using this X Steganography and using it in the modern age for things like the UFO file, which completely get backed away and held under this wall of secrecy. But in former times, we found this was happening in the mystery schools, in the very heart of the mystery schools. So we have to find out now, since we see something like CERN operating in the open, that is working openly with this idea and this concept of particle smashing, what they're trying to achieve actually. So they have an ostensible purpose and a deeper one. And the best way for us to do that is to examine what it is that they go on the record with and to try to look through them to see what it is that they're trying to accomplish beyond the rhetoric of we're looking for Higgs boson. The reason there's so much mystery around CERN, because you know, it is an institution that's been set up in Geneva since 1959, is they've held such extreme secrecy, and whenever they have been challenged in court, for example, over the Hadron Collider by scientists who felt like it was an environmental hazard and very dangerous to the magnetosphere, when it's turned on, they've seen these kind of extraordinary things happen. You know, what's interesting about that is basically it's their own secrecy that has allowed this kind of scrutiny. And one of the key members who set up CERN was John J. McCloy, which, you know, we've covered in depth on this program, things like the JFK assassination. And McCloy, just being a part of Citibank and really deep in that Rockefeller influence, is a real mover and a shaker, and is somebody who was involved in the reconstruction of Germany after the war. But we also have to keep in mind that he, you know, maintained there during the 1936 Olympics an interview in a booth with Adolf Hitler. I mean, just very unusual connections this guy has. And he was the one who set up the original funding for CERN. And CERN is a very unusual case of, as the scientists found out when they went to sue it, of a sovereign entity that basically acts like a country. Now, at the same time, while we're examining it, I don't want us to fall prey to any kind of superstitions, as we see there's a lot of malarkey out there about, you know, the Antichrist coming through CERN or something like that. Look, the reality is scary enough. And the things that these people are shooting for are deep and have occult traces to them. But let's find out what they are by examining who were the original kind of progenitors of the entire situation of psychic experience and scientific research continuing to go along, although they split in the public side. On this completely covert side, they have continued that research, and we've seen it in things like remote viewing. We've seen it in so many different aspects and areas where the CIA will adopt something. But on the surface, it's deny, 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 and that is the name of the game. So we need to keep this in mind. And I want to remind you also to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up now for the newsletter, because I do want to mention this kind of dicey situation with social media that's been going on. Everyone has seen it. Olivia, I heard today they knocked Alex Jones off of PayPal.
Yes, I know. It's very disturbing.
You know, I mean, this is interesting, right? Because you can say what you want to about this guy or that guy, but the idea of these tech companies ganging up and acting as a corptocracy to stifle speech that they don't agree with, you know, it's absolutely fascinating. I mean, you wonder where they think they're going. And, you know, this only proves when deep researchers have looked at the situation and said these corptocracy guys were trying to set up these different financial strata, the North American Union and an Asian zone. You know, they literally just want the corporations on top running the things. They just want to forget about the constitutions and all the rest of it. And when they get people who are a problem one way or another to them, and those people develop a following, then wow, things get really out of hand and they show their real fascist tendencies, and that's what we're going through now. With, what is that great word that we're using to describe it? It's techno-fascism or something like that. It was
silicon fascism.
Silicon fascism. That really, yeah, that sums it up pretty well, actually, I have to say. And there's no question that we're going to do a lot of shows here in the fall. We're in an election season. There's no doubt about it. But before we get into all that kind of thing, I really want to have us get back to this point of understanding where the mystery schools influence the nature of the situation technologically, sociologically, politically, even spiritually, that we're in right now. And it's my feeling, after looking at this field for a number of years and having been in mainstream media, that there's something missing in terms of how people analyze things. Because you'll get fantastic analysis on all these different situations, but we don't seem to get, the penny doesn't drop. There's something fundamentally lacking in our assessment of the nature of the situation, of who are the powers that are on planet Earth and why are they doing the things that they're doing. Something missing there. And for me, it's right in the heart of the mystery schools, because the mystery schools have completely gone to war during the 19th century. And that war, which is a real push-pull, can be tracked and has been pointed out by the best movements that survived from it, the public movements like anthroposophy and theosophy. So during this period that Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, described, 1840, there was a wave of scientific materialism that swept in, and there was a deep, and very hardcore decision to be made regarding what information would come out to the public about the mystery schools, who had held on to information for thousands of years, literally. And in a nutshell, a very small group within those mystery schools decided they needed to let this information out. And the information related to things like psychic experience, deeper phenomena, the afterlife, this whole realm of information which kind of floated out there. And, what happened was really a kind of a wild experiment, because you got these spiritualism craze and you got people doing seances and all the rest of it. Well, how this influences the situation when you get into things like CERN and all that is, if we track it back now and we track it through certain figures, like we've tracked it through Emma Britton, who gave us a major key when she mentioned the Orphic Circle. Now, what was the Orphic Circle? I've done a number of programs on it here. In a nutshell, the Orphic Circle was a group of political figures, literary figures, people of noble rank, in Emma Britton's words, who were set up to create this ultimately secret esoteric group that would find excellent students to create the best channels and have them, through somnambulist trance, acquire incredibly powerful and decisive, insightful information. And in that group, as Emma Britton identified it, were Lord Bulwer-Lytton. Bulwer-Lytton was not only a fantastic author from this period, but he's actually an incredible politician as well. A real deep figure in kind of UK politics and social world. Benjamin Disraeli, a future prime minister, was in this circle. Charles Dickens, major literary figure, of course. Who can forget Charles Dickens and his amazing work? And these people were determined to keep this an absolute secret and to use the information gained. At first, I guess we could say they were looking for the knowledge of reality, the nature of reality, the deeper kind of esoteric secrets that so many had gone before looking for them, the kind of philosopher's stone quest. But as time went on, it looked like they used most of the information they were getting to uncover state secrets. And this was kind of the darker aspect of the Orphic Circle. When we talk about the Orphic Circle, I don't want to think of them as sort of a all black magic type entity. It looks like there was something of a deep purpose in setting it up initially, especially since Bulwer-Lytton has been identified by Blavatsky and Rudolf Steiner as a high initiate relating to the Rosicrucians, who's so much of his work. And if you want to check out something very compelling by Bulwer-Lytton, I'd recommend The Coming Race, which is Vril. It's a fantastic book about this very unusual advanced group that lived underground and possessed this fascinating power called Vril, which eventually got, in Nazi symbolism and stuff, they pick up this idea, but, like the Nazis thing, everything had to orient itself around the Aryan supremacy and that whole thing. But way back there in the 19th century, we had this. So there in that period of time, there's a quote from Emma about the Orphic Circle. And I want to get into this so we can understand who Ada Lovelace is, and the environment, I guess, that she was going into as really, the only daughter of someone of a very noble rank, and that's Lord Byron. Her quote is this, talking about her unusual childhood, where she was very highly talented in music, in acting, and all these different things, but she was kept from other people. And she had a very unusual upbringing. Let's take a quick look at Emma as a girl who, as I found out later, would become the original inspiration for Alice in Wonderland. That is Emma Britton. Emma Hardinge Britton, who wrote Ghostland and really had this incredible impact on the early days of Theosophy. Absolutely crucial figure. This is her quote about, in her own biography, which came out at the end of her life, relating to the Orphic Circle, which she was a member of as a teenage girl. Never understood by those around me, it was only after years and when I became called and associated with a secret society of occultists and attended their sessions in London as one of their clairvoyant and magnetic subjects, that I myself began to comprehend why a young girl, fairly educated and blessed with many advantages, should be branded with such peculiarities of disposition as must inevitably shut her off from all companionship with children of her own age and standing. So she was literally just dealing with adults. The Society of Occultists, to whom I can now only allude and who are named in Ghostland as the Orphic Circle, obtained knowledge by means I'm not at liberty to mention. This is quite fascinating, and I want to point out with Emma, even at the end of her life, she is keeping certain types of obligations of code, this code of ethics about giving information out. Quite fascinating. None of the members were known as such outside their circles. The existence of the society was undreamed of. I want to underline that. The existence of the society was undreamed of. Think about it. We've had so many movements in the 19th century, Golden Dawn, Theosophy. Why was this one undreamed of? How secret was this group? How did they maintain that secrecy? It's crucial to keep that in mind. The existence of the society was undreamed of, and those whom they chose to affiliate with what they knew of and called. Let's try that again. None of the members were known as such outside their circles. In other words, no one in their own circles knew they were part of the Orphic Circle. The existence of the society was undreamed of, and those whom they chose to affiliate with they knew of and called. So somehow they were tracking these people. I, having thus been favored, obtained a clue to my own exceptional early experiences, which the subsequent developments of spiritualism stamped as natural seership. Natural seership, I think this is very important. And that's one of the great reasons we have Gigi Young on tonight. And Gigi is someone who's really become such a fantastic asset to the X series because of her deep ability to obtain psychic information and to really understand what those states are all about. And that's someone who I consider to have that natural seership. And this is something where Emma Britton is saying, they were the ones who told her about her own ability because she had so many unusual experiences as a child. Now, as it turns out, Emma would go on to do all these different sessions for them, and they literally would put her and these other girls into trance. and the girls being somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14, generally. And they would obtain trance information from them after they would put them in this somnambulous state, which is associated very strongly with the work of Franz Anton Mesmer. Now, this show isn't about Mesmer, so you can take my word for it. We're going to do a deep episode on Mesmer, but suffice to say, we're kind of looking at someone who was able to tap the deep abilities of the psyche. So Emma goes about for many years, doing this for them over the course of about 3 years. And at the end of that time, her father dies. And I believe now, it's hard to get deep information on this, but it looks like her father was the connection to the Orphic Circle. And so therefore, when he dies, they have to make a decision in relation to using her. And her mother's objections or all the rest of it. It's hard to say. But what happens is she gets this incredible gig as an actress. And she goes away and she's in France, and then she gets taken to New York, and all these different things happen to her. And eventually she becomes a medium again. And then all of the stuff about the Orphic Circle floods back to her, including the fact that they put her in situations where certain types of poltergeist would appear when she was doing these trance sessions. Now, poltergeist and apotheum are, I want you to, this is like a huge crisscross with these two things. So when I say apotheum, and we think about things like that come up, for example, like missing time, when contactees talk about this type of thing, it's a kind of a physics distortion. Well, poltergeist is the same thing. It's like two different types of dimensions meeting at the same time, causing all these crazy off-the-charts physics problems. And these are the types of things that the mystery schools guarded themselves against, and which I believe the X Steganography becomes the kind of caretaker of. That if they move information through this X Steganography and only initiates know about it, then it won't fall into the hands of people who would use it unwisely or to, say, dominate an economy or something like that. And let's face it, a lot of these groups, that's exactly the first idea that would come to them. So now let's get into Ada Lovelace. And before we do, I want to check with Miss Olivia. Mm-hmm. How are we doing over there?
We're doing great. So can I ask you a couple questions up front?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so Occult Priestess was asking, who gave them permission to start CERN? I didn't vote on that. And Michael Wisdom is asking, how does CERN get away with being its own country? How can they be untouchable? Could you just go over that a little bit?
I think it's pretty interesting. What I'd refer you to is my interview with Dr. Joseph Farrell on this, where we both went deep on it. Farrell had just written the Third Wave book, which is fantastic if you want to understand the kind of post-war fascist international influence on CERN and the European Union. So both of those things are fascinating. The episode is called CERN Apotheosis, and I highly recommend that as a good answer for those things. In a nutshell, it's not very clear how they have the ability, but they were so carefully set up. And it looks like the countries that cooperated in setting up CERN under the aegis of a scientific project, and as a nuclear watchdog organization. The fascination with the Large Hadron Collider is something which is more recent from CERN. So I think that at some point somebody decided this is a great vehicle, but since this is highly secret research, remember CERN is one of the #1 users, if not the #1 user of the internet, because of the amount of equations that they are constantly publishing, getting sets of data after their experiments. Problem is, when they turn the experiments are hyper secret. That's one. Two, what I think is crucial about CERN is when we look at them, really on the surface, they're doing one thing. But there's very unusual factors to it, including its budget, which is over $8 billion. That's a military science project. So they're not identifying what it is. I think that's problematic. Two, we have these incredibly destructive effects on the environment when that thing is turned on in relation to the magnetosphere. And this is something that I go into in that episode. So I highly recommend it. That'll give you kind of the good background on it. And of course, Farrell's book, Third Wave, I think is also quite helpful in that regard. I do want to say in relation to CERN that, you know, we're going right into the heart of the X series with CERN. This is what CERN's announcement are, that CERN finds new X particle. These are the major science papers now. This is not, you know, some theory that's out there or some conspiracy. These are science magazines publishing the data. They were calling it 4 new X particles. And how big a deal this is. You know what, Olivia, actually, on the table here is a paper with red ink on it. I think I left it up there. Thank you. But
there's a lot of them with red ink.
No, that's okay. Just bring them over. That's fine. That is, yeah, that's good. It's the name of the particle. I wanted to get it. They call them, oh, those are good. Those are exactly what I was looking for. Perfect. Thank you. So in looking at that, if you look up CERN X particle, you'll get a, you know, flurry of these incredible stories dealing with this. Physicists at CERN have discovered a family, which they now call one, a new exotic particle. And they've decided, you know, this is something. Now they call it particle X. So particle X, now, if we know the X Steganography, it's playing right into it. And they're calling these particles, quote, beauty particles, which I find quite fascinating, and luminous particles. And they say they're right between the particles that we've been studying. So I'm not going to give a big scientific treatise on them here, but I am going to touch on a couple of things, which is that, you know, CERN being really well known for the atom smashing and, you know, looking for this effect. They were saying, oh, we always theorized that there was a God particle out there, the Higgs boson. But as it turns out, you know, we already knew it was out there. And when we did the tests with the Hadron Collider, it turns out it was true. Well, oddly enough, they're saying now that they've never discovered this. This is a whole new set of particles for particle physicists to study, and they are the X particles. Now, what's going to come out of this, I think, is very interesting because as we know, and as I've pointed out with X Steganography, when they move that technology, which is advanced and which has this Apotheum effect, and so the massive secrecy attached to it, whenever they come out publicly, it's kind of our only way to track exactly what's going on. So they're communicating, remember, for people who know to see it. For us, it looks like, oh, they're dealing with particle X, big deal, it's an experimental particle. This is how they identify the work to a group of people without having to brief each person individually. That's how the X Steganography works. It's a classic example. But yeah, those are great questions. We're going to get deep into questions in the second part of the show, and make all your questions in caps. You guys have been really good at that, but it makes Olivia's job a lot easier. Mm-hmm. Would you say so?
Absolutely.
And just a reminder, you're watching Dark Journalist, and tonight our special guest is Gigi Young, who will be joining us maybe in about 20-25 minutes or so. In the meantime, let's meet Ada Lovelace and find out her connection to CERN. First of all, Ada is quite extraordinary for a few reasons, but let's first take a look at this, which is literally the CERN Tarot card of Ada Lovelace. CERN Tarot card has kind of a ring to it, doesn't it? The mystery schools meet high technology. The seance room meets the laboratory, right? One of the things in the middle of all this for our friends over there at CERN is this group dealing with this Hexen 2.0, and it literally is called Cybernetic Seance. And this all relates to the work of a British artist, actually, Suzanne Treister, and I'm going to get deep as we go along here. But my first introduction to Ada for you is this picture, and I think it is quite incredible, as they call her the Enchantress of Numbers. And of course, she is the mathematician, the first computer programmer. It's all true. Ada, by the way, is a trademark programming language developed by the U.S. Department of Defense, also very crucial when we're looking at this situation. She created a program for Charles Babbage's analytical engine. These are all breakthroughs in mathematics, breakthroughs in computing, and she was right in the heart of it. But who was Ada Lovelace? She had a famous dad, as I mentioned, which is Lord Byron here. An incredible character. And, you know, Olivia and I were talking about him last night, and we just decided that he's basically the first rock star. You know, he has this kind of incredible success as a literary master of stories and poetry. He goes and gets involved with Greek independence. He's known for these wild affairs and scandals and
bisexual affairs.
Yes, and he you know,
underage affairs.
Do you have anything else over there?
It's very scandalous.
Oh my God, Olivia's got the dossier, but that'll be a different show. Let me tell you. Subscribers only, right? Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say about?
That's it.
Okay, that's pretty good. Well, this incredible affair that he had with his half sister, who, in his defense, he hadn't met until you know, they were much older. But he certainly, he had a way of drawing attention to himself, put it that way. And he had the kind of like, you know, live fast, die young kind of thing going on. And like I said, he died at age 36. This is Ada Lovelace at the age of 6. And it's my opinion that this is when they started to groom her for work in the Orphic Circle. One of the things that's described about her early childhood with her mom is that her mom, by the way, is an incredible mathematician herself and a very kind of church-going, upright kind of woman. And her whole relationship with Byron is really out of left field. And, you know, here he is the ultimate kind of scrupulous, marauder, genius guy. And, you know, her mother really was coming from a totally different neck of the woods. And she really believed in success. She believed in accomplishing something for God. I mean, she had a very deep religious sense mixed with an incredibly kind of deep scientific responsibility, let's say. But there are unusual things that she had Ada do, such as sit still for 2 hours at a time. That's in her biography, and I've always found this very interesting in consideration of the techniques that the Orphic Circle used, because when you are sitting still for 2 hours at a time, you will naturally go into a different kind of alpha state. And this is something that they use to get the candidates for the Orphic Circle into these trance states. And as we move along here, we're going to see that there's lots of reasons to suspect that's exactly what was happening in her more early life. But I want to read a quote from Ada Lovelace to get some idea of where she was coming from. That's great. It's just like me, Olivia. This page is called the Ferry Connection. Isn't that
there
good?
You go.
There we go. And that's Ferry, F-A-E. Yes. Ada was forced to lie still for extended periods of time because her mother believed it would help her develop self-control. Yeah, I mean, this instantly, right off the bat, I found something fascinating about that. But she also became obsessed with the concept of flight by age 11. And in her teens, she studied avian anatomy and mechanical engineering and came up with something called flyology. And I'll tell you, some of the models of this that were developed based on her descriptions, this is 1827, 1828. And she seems to me 60, 70 years ahead of the pack. Now, her mother sets her up with what? An incredible set of tutors to bring out the best in her mathematically, to bring the best out in her musically, to bring the best out in her language skills. But Mary Somerville was probably the most crucial, although Mary Shelley will become her dear friend as we get along here. Mary Somerville is known for something quite interesting, which is she's one of the early advocates for Planet X. And you know, the Planet X kind of aspect of this, I think, is important to look at, because Mary Somerville is known early on as one of the best innovators in mathematics and astronomy. And she becomes the #1 kind of handler for Ada Lovelace. Let's get a more adult picture of Lovelace here, though, because we have so many good ones. This is an extraordinary person, and I come away with some of these people. I come away with nothing but admiration. And Ada Lovelace's work is just going to completely, you know, before it's over, we're going to blow your mind here. That is Ada Lovelace. And really the kind of quintessential genius of the early 19th century. But she's going to get into these situations where she has to kind of balance out her more esoteric mind with her mathematical mind and come to these different situations. So her main tutor is Mary Somerville, and she comes up with this Planet X idea. I just want a quick quote here from Mary Somerville relating to this. She says, if after the lapse, her book is called Connection, by the way, it's Connexion. Okay, there you go. She wrote, if after the lapse of years, the tables formed from a combination of numerous observations should still be inadequate to represent the motions of Uranus, the discrepancies may reveal the existence, even the mass and orbit of a body placed forever beyond the sphere of vision. Okay, this is her Planet X. And of course, they were developing ideas, and different planets would come into play later, like Pluto and all the rest of it that they couldn't see at the time. But in terms of the trajectory of this one, it was never found, and she felt there was a mass out there beyond. Her writings led the young John Couch Adams to look for Neptune, and in 1846 he found Neptune based on that, but she didn't think that was the planet. So her Planet X was still hanging out there. Now, this is very interesting in terms of when we talk about these people and their beliefs. This is quite unusual. This is a quote from Mary Somerville relating to how she worked as this incredible mathematics genius and astronomical genius when women were predominantly confined to the home. Quote, I may remark that the curious transformations many formula can undergo, the unsuspected and to a beginner apparently impossible identity of forms, exceedingly dissimilar at first sight, is, I think, one of the chief difficulties in the early part of mathematical studies. I'm often reminded of certain sprites and fairies one reads of, who are at one's elbow in one shape now, and the next minute in a form most dissimilar. This allusion to fairies in Mary Somerville's work, in Ada Lovelace's work, and in the work of Ada Lovelace's mother, who will actually fund this character named George Macdonald and become his benefactor. And all of his work are these fairy tales about the fairy kingdom and dealing with the fairy kingdom. This thing about fairies, whenever we get around the Orphic Circle, is an absolutely crucial aspect, and you'll find it replete throughout the work of Bulwer-Lytton, Macdonald, and here we have Ada Lovelace and her tutor kind of mentioning this sprite. I'll call it the sprite factor. Okay, we're coming on strong. And how are we doing over there, Olivia?
That's great. What was the Bulwer-Lytton book that you were recommending?
It's The Coming Race.
Okay.
And Vril is the kind of name that's given to it, you know, in the kind of casual fashion. That's sort of more like a subtitle, but The Coming Race is the main title. Zanoni is another one. It's fantastic. Really, this guy encounters Rosicrucian angels. I mean, does it get any better than that? You're watching Dark Journalist, and I want to remind you to go to Dark Journalist right now after the immense shutdown that we've been seeing on all these different stars of alternative media. You know, I quit alternative media. I'm just doing dark journalism now because they really, there's so many different wild things I think that are coming up, and I'm sure we're going to get some of them in the questions. But, you know, independent dark journalism is what I do. And so many people, I think, having these brush wars where YouTube is going after the social media, you know, all that comes around because at the end of the day, these larger groups really want to stamp out that kind of competition, let's say, and market share of ideas in the marketplace of ideas. They know that things like MSNBC, you know, can't stand up to real truth tellers because MSNBC wants to bomb Syria, you know, because GE has such a role in their ownership, and GE is a major war profiteer. So this is how these things roll. But that will be another show. let's take a quick look at George Macdonald, since I mentioned fairies and such. This is a picture taken by Lewis Carroll of the incredible Alice in Wonderland fame, who we covered Alice in Wonderland. It's one of the kind of most favorite episodes in the X series, and because we go deep on what Alice in Wonderland was all about, and the Orphic Circle's identity coming in there, and also the role of Emma Britton as Alice. This is a shot of Macdonald and his daughter, and it's interesting because Lewis Carroll called the shot, Macdonald's daughter dreaming. And this whole dream aspect and how they kind of work with this fundamental Orphic Circle idea of training these psychics at a very early age and developing them as mediums, and then going through these kind of teenage years and then cycling them out and almost like kind of washing clear their memories of having done any of this work, this incredible somnambulist trance channel work. But Macdonald, we should keep in mind, wrote these books about the kingdom of the fairies and all the rest of it. So we have to kind of keep this in mind as we go along, that this fairy link is something that's endemic whenever we look hardcore at these groups. It seems like they are looking at that level, and we have to start to wonder, what is it that's in the literature, the understanding, or the experience of mediums, or people who are working with this other type of world? What is it about fairies? What is it about this whole idea? And how does that correlate with things when we get to, for example, the UFO file and Apotheum? How are these things interrelated? How does this relate to psychic experience? Why does it come up at all? You have the realm of the imagination and the realm of the fantastic. So what are we talking about here? Ada Lovelace, a little bit later in life, developed as a mathematician, as the first computer programmer, and as a splendid musician. In fact, she wrote the nervous system of calculus in something called Loveland's trilogy. But one of the other names for that three-part movement was mesmerism. And Ada Lovelace gave lectures on mesmerism, talked about how magnetism worked physically, and how these things were crucial for the development of science. These were people at this level, like Ada Lovelace, who believed they could marry, like she said she was the bride of science, these deeper metaphysical concepts into the scientific movements. And they were actually disgusted with the scientific materialism that was taking over. This is the kind of interesting thing that happens where the scientific materialism takes over the work of people like Ada Lovelace. Let's go a little bit deeper on CERN, because CERN celebrating Ada Lovelace, I think, is quite fascinating. It seems that with her disdain for scientific materialism, along with Babbage's disdain for it as well, these people seem to have a root idea of something else, something better. And they thought that they were moving these more esoteric concepts into the main line, so that, the main line would also have the scientific thought, and side by side with it would be this higher knowledge thought, opening up these other realms. Even Rudolf Steiner's work is called spiritual science. It is about moving that level of fundamental esoteric understanding, higher spiritual understanding, into the material technological modes, so that it's not just a material convenience, a material luxury, it's something deeper. And that takes us into all kinds of conversations, as we've had here, about Cayce's vision of Atlantis, which was high technology. And there was one group there that was using it for what? They were using it for this incredible explosion, this spiritual expansion. They were interfacing with higher spiritual beings from the outer spheres, according to Cayce's readings. But the other group was using it to, send lasers down from these master crystals on their enemies. So the Belial group and the Amelius group, this is the balance. And it seems to me, when you get to the 19th century, you're looking at a super fast forward of the same battle. And in fact, one thing we're going to get into tonight is these groups have indicated that a lot of this battle has gone down previously. And they indicated that if, when they were raising this message up of the mystery schools in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, that by the time you get to World War I, they were looking around and saying, you know what? If it fails now, if the message fails now, if the public cannot catch on to the message now, we'll have another chance, a 20 to 30-year window in about 100 years. And we get that particular comment is from Steiner in 1916. So we're looking at 2016 to 2046 as the period that he's discussing. Let's see what people like Ada Lovelace were attempting to set up versus what actually happened. This is, I want to say, the parameter of CERN. It's very interesting because you have Alice over here, which is one of their major reactors. You have the actual collider is here. They've set this up in a very interesting circle. And what's happening is they're utilizing deep underground tunnels. Well, this is no secret, by the way. These aren't the secret ones. And they are creating conditions with these atom smashers where they send these signals back and forth between France and Switzerland, for example. And what's happening is they're developing temperatures that are colder than space cold and temperatures that are hotter than space, than sun hot. So we're dealing with the deepest, most extreme kind of technological experiments. And I've pointed out here that they're working on this thing relating to what is basically a new particle. And they're calling the particle X for any of you X Steganography followers out there. Let's take a look at a project that they sponsored from this artist that I mentioned earlier, which is all about these CERN Tarot cards. Now, they are fascinating, each and every one. And, you know, the ideas that are shared here and the imagery that's shared are very compelling and very ingenious. Right off the bat, I want to say the people who put these together are incredibly informed. But nonetheless, they represent a very unusual perspective, let's say, relating to CERN and what they want to present to the world, especially as this was developed for a particular group working inside of CERN. This is their King of Wands, which is Nikola Tesla. Get a nice shot of that. And I'm going to provide some links for where you can see all of these, but I want to run through some of the ones that I think are absolutely essential. As we know, they held Ada Lovelace in very high regard because she, of course, was the first computer programmer, which means CERN literally would not exist without her. This one, the Three of Swords, is very compelling as it has MK Ultra at the very heart of what they're designing there. And they're kind of showcasing, just like a tarot set would, these different symbols and what their symbology would be. And what it says in the middle is hypnotic agent programming, CIA behavior control experiments, witch doctor study, ESP research. Now, do you see how and at the bottom it says hypnotic induction? What a flip, in a way, from the Orphic Circle and this work kind of that was developing at this period. Here is CERN saying this Three of Swords cups represents the, say, MK Ultra and what they were about. I don't know if the people at CERN are so much saying, you know, we back the philosophy of MK Ultra. They're saying this is an aspect of where this type of thing went. I want to touch on this one. Knave of Swords, interplanetary internet. That, of course, is the Tree of Life setup. We have a few weird things to look at here, and I have to spend a little time on the imagery. This is fabulous stuff. Over here is the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Remember, these cards come right out of CERN. And they are, well, I mentioned the artist. We'll go back to her again, don't worry. That's NASA. So the Knave of Swords is deployed internets, wired and tetherless. But the trick to this whole thing, of course, DARPA is in here too, is interplanetary internet and interplanetary gateways. It's quite unusual. Interplanetary gateways are not something that exist in terms of technology. For example, we do not have the internet available on Mars. So you have to start to wonder what some of this is starting to relate to. Each one, I think, showing the solar system and the star in the middle. I'm going to keep rolling. Aldous Huxley, very interestingly here, is portrayed in The Fool, is the card for Aldous Huxley. Now, Huxley is the writer of Brave New World, which warned against this kind of pharmaceutical mind control that would take over and how we would all be kind of developed out of test tubes. But he wrote the book in 1933. He also was best friends and next door neighbors with Krishnamurti, who was the top man that Theosophy was grooming to become the world teacher Maitreya for the Order of the Star. Huxley, of course, merits a whole show by himself, but I think what's important is that they're calling him the fool in all of this. And I think that that shows maybe, I don't know, what would you think of the Fool card, Olivia?
Well, I mean, it all starts and ends with the Fool, doesn't it?
True.
Mm-hmm.
And here, this is the card
Mm-hmm.
with Huxley in the middle. Quite fascinating.
I love how psychedelic that card
It is certainly psychedelic, yeah. No, like I said, the ideas and the artistry behind it are fabulous. But when I start to lock into the mentation, let's say, and I'm looking at Huxley as a fool, and Huxley thinking, if I warn the world about where they're going with this pharmaceutical kind of dictatorship and this mind control dictatorship of like everything is sort of like a luxury version of Nazi Germany. They're calling him the fool, and they're sort of saying Brave New World mysticism, concentration camp of the mind. That one struck me as particularly weird. This is a shot of Alice, of course, and that is the Hadron. That is the Alice Collider that we concentrated on in the Alice episode. It's crucial, I think, because it also is carrying out experiments very much along the lines of the Hadron Collider. And there's all the allusions to Alice in Wonderland in it. The Klystron technology used for spacecraft communication, actually in deep space radar, is the same technology that they use for the particle smashers. That was developed by who? The Varian brothers, who we've demonstrated on this show, were deep, deep, deep students of the Theosophical Society. They brought these things forward from a temple called Intentional Community with the temple, the Halcyon Temple community there in California. And when I was talking about California just now, it was Ojai that Huxley and Krishnamurti were living in.
Can I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, Mythmaker says something really interesting. The fool is the one who is detached and goes wherever the divine will takes him. Huxley might be the dog in the Fool card, barking at the fool, trying to tell him he's walking off a cliff.
Oh, that's pretty good.
I like that.
Yeah, well, you're a fast study, my friend. I would certainly agree with a lot of that. Something I wanted to point out as I went into the background of this artist, this is something that she put together, and she is quite remarkable. In fact, I want to have her come on the show to describe some of where these drawings were coming from, but the fact that CERN gave her an artist in residency and she produced these cards for this developer group at CERN, I think is quite unusual, even for CERN to associate itself in any way, shape, or form with this imagery. Again, these are groups who understand these things quite well. This one is 1 million years after the internet, and it says algorithm, and then on the bottom it says survivor, and then F. Quite clearly, Olivia, you might like this one too, as you can see these saucers right in the middle.
I could decorate the whole house with posters of this. Fabulous.
Unbelievable. But the message is very clear. The survivor are these ships. That's the UFO file they're referring to here. So, you know, it's quite interesting, the impression, you know, an artist can have a lark and can have an inspiration, and that's one thing. What I'm getting into here is the crisscross of CERN relating to this project as a cybernetic seance, which is what she termed it, and then going back to the Ada Lovelace, going back to the Emma Britton foundations of the Orphic Circle and the types of information that they would get, which were obviously technical, relating to the nature of the universe and all the rest of it. When we go into the work of people like Cayce, there were people who pulled Cayce aside. Edison got readings with Cayce for electrical engineering purposes. Nikola Tesla himself got a reading with Cayce. This is the way that this information can be obtained. These people in the heart of CERN know how to obtain that kind of information, because the Orphic Circle is the connection as we get into it, because the very people that CERN is celebrating are members of that circle. And we're going to show more of them here. One thing, I did skip one. What's also fascinating is this one. Now, this is particularly interesting if somebody's been watching this show, because you might remember Robert Sarbarker, who was the physicist who basically got disqualified on the basis of the fact that, oddly enough, he had kind of outed the UFO file and said, yes, we did in fact study these crash retrievals, and here's what happened. So it's actually quite fascinating, because he was saying, yeah, there were UFO crashes and we did go through the material, but he went on record with it. This is what's unusual. This guy is John von Neumann, who we found out from Sarbarker took over the UFO file after Sarbarker took it over from Bush. So what do they call that card? That card is the death card, and he's got the Manhattan Project in this and quantum mechanics, but he oversaw the UFO file for over a decade. And of course, he's somebody that we're going to do a whole episode on. So these cards are incredibly well informed, because Neumann is not really a traditional character that you would turn to just to talk about science. Let's keep that in mind. And if I'm correct, Gigi Young is with us. Are you with us, Gigi?
I'm here. Hello.
How are you?
Everybody.
It's great to see you.
You too. It's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Wow. I want to say that Gigi's been doing absolutely incredible work. And I have to really tell everyone just how deep and how important the work that you've done on behalf of the X series is. And I want to say I'm always impressed. And, I could say a typical day might start where, I've exchanged an idea of two with Gigi about something. And then the next day we might check in on something and she'll say, wow, I may have something for you. And wow, it's always off the charts. And you just get used to that around Gigi. It's incredible work.
Oh yeah, there's been a lot of interesting overlaps. So yeah, I think it's an important series. Yeah, so I think that's why it's happening.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Now, one of the things I wanted to touch base with you on right away before we even get started is you're doing something now, which is a intuitive training course where you are kind of training people how to tap into their intuitive centers.
Yeah, I have an intuition development course, and it's not necessarily something that you have to be like a crazy psychic or something. Developing your intuition can be creativity. It can be, getting through a problem that you're trying to work out. It's processing faster. That's what really intuition is. It's being able to process things faster, pick up on things. If you're meeting someone for a business meeting, is this person a good partner that you should be investing in? It's really taking in more information. And so that's really what I teach and what I've got going on right now. So yeah,
it's like sharpening your basic intuitive skills in everyday situations.
Oh, absolutely. That's probably what the majority of people will identify as their intuition. And the course just helps you identify with what you are primarily, because we all have a certain constitution, and then how to develop it, and then how to go deeper if you want to go deeper. But I do feel like it's something that everybody should do, because as you're talking about CERN, the reason why this kind of technology that's quite scary exists is because people aren't aware of the levels in which it's functioning on. And we need to wake up, and waking up means lighting up. It means connecting with our intuition, whether it be through me or whether it be just through buying books. There's so many great books out there. Just Google it, whatever it is, just develop it, you know?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It is fascinating. I have to say that I've studied CERN for a long time, and I've become aware of things, let's say, on a deep intellectual level by studying the type of things that they do to keep their projects secret, let's say, and reading deeply about their cases and all the rest of it. When I started talking with you about CERN, something different in the flavor of my own understanding of who they were started to open up. And I thought that this is a fascinating thing for us to jump off on here right off the boat. Before we go any further, though, I want to mention that there's a huge fan of yours here.
Oh.
And that's me. Could you guys talk about the loudness situation?
Is it too loud here?
Yeah, Gigi's echoing a little bit.
Oh,
okay. You can lower it.
Letting me know. How is it now?
No, it's fine.
That's good.
It's totally fine.
Okay?
No, the audio is great. I think literally our speakers are just cranked.
Oh, okay. Let me know, though. I don't want to ruin anything.
No, your audio is fine. You're coming through perfect. So what I've found out in looking at CERN from a certain type of level is that when they are working on promoting something like that CERN Tarot deck, I think that we get a little more of an inflection of who they are on the inside. And when Ada Lovelace popped up and we opened the show with her, you know, Ada is somebody that I had pegged for a while as someone who was deep, deep in the Orphic Circle. But when you pointed out to me that Ada Lovelace was a part of this tarot series, that opened up a whole different kind of a thing. And this is kind of what you're talking about, which is really applying in combination and in concert these types of ideas and bouncing these ideas to arrive at a different kind of plateau around something like CERN, which, you know, exists in such secrecy that no one really knows anything about it.
Yes. Yeah, that was a complete synchronicity. I had no idea that you were already hot on the trail of Ada. And somebody actually messaged me and sent me that tarot deck because they'd seen me on your series.
That's a concentric circle all the way around.
And I made a video about CERN being addictive. And then they're like, okay, I have to send her this deck. And then I sent it to you. And so it's interesting how when we talk about things, other people kind of stand up and say, hey, you know what, this fits here and all of that. And we can, you know, communicate.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating to me because whenever I've come to you with a problem relating to CERN and said, you know, because I understand when you go into these things, when you're studying something like CERN, when you're looking at things like the Orphic Circle, somebody who is a sensitive, who has real intuitive abilities, is kind of the essential missing ingredient in a lot of this research, in my opinion. And when you are able to tap in, there's some things that I think that you tap into, and the information that comes out is just incredible. And, you know, we've taken a look at why that might be in looking at your background with the Corsons. And we're going to do a little bit more of that tonight. But I want to ask you, because I was so interested in the things that you brought forward about CERN, what is it from your own tuning in, let's say, that you've been able to figure out, just as in terms of like bullet points?
Well, I view as more of a mystic, I view CERN as an energy. Like the technology to me is like, what is that? What is this thing? I don't see it that way. I see it as an energy. And I see it as the potential to be a very destructive energy by actually magnifying states of consciousness when they shouldn't be magnified. So human beings are meant to develop in a very gradual way, essentially, because on this planet we have very deep layers of perception. So we have to do it very carefully and very almost slowly, like Kundalini awakening kind of stuff I'm talking about here. And if things go too fast and things crystallize too fast, which is, I believe, from what I've seen, what CERN tends to do, it will crystallize consciousness in a place that it shouldn't be done. It shouldn't be crystallized. There's too many wounds. There's too much stuff going on in the lower chakra system. I know I'm getting a little esoteric, but it crystallizes things in a place that is not harmonic. And that is not good. And I also saw that CERN has an addictive quality for people, because when you get these rushes of energy, then you're almost like addicted to it. And so why that's significant, why that's important, is because if you think about people working with this technology, and if you think they can walk away from it, and you think that it's just going to be like, okay, it's fine, I think there's an addictive element to it, or a very intense possession psychological element to it. And that's just me.
Wow, absolutely. This is absolutely fascinating. Here's why. When I looked at CERN, and when I went through it, going through their research papers and all the rest of it, I decided something about it. And looking at the work of Dr. Farrell, I felt that there was a split in the organization about what they were up to. And it also seemed to me that there were weird things going on, like when they came out with this unusual security camera footage of what looked like a sacrifice ritual and all that. It would give them a bad name, you know, to do this. Why were things like that happening? When you tuned into it, and I mean, I asked you literally, as a psychic, I want you to look at this aspect. You came back without me saying anything about it and said, I've got this split between these groups. That to me is fascinating when that information comes together and correlates.
Yeah, I remember that was the first read, and sometimes the first read's the best read.
Okay.
Because it's, for whatever reason, it's like the most significant information, and you got to give it sometimes some more time for more things to ripen, I would say. But I do remember, yeah, seeing a split. And I don't think that CERN or any of these particle acceleration technologies or any high technology was necessarily created to be destructive on any level. I don't believe that.
Right.
But I do believe that there are people who are disconnected from their spirit and from their heart and certain sensibilities, and they get lost. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think that's what happens, is you have a splitting between people who still have a moral compass and people who become fulfilled by something darker because they're not full on their own. And that is, I think, where most splits happen. But that's what I did see happening with CERN as well.
Well, it's fascinating when groups like the Orphic Circle, for example, they tune in and they get information from entities. They get information from the subconscious minds of other individuals. This is something that Cayce talked about. You know, they said, where do you get the information from? And he says, I see myself as a tiny dot outside of my body, getting the information from the subconscious mind of the person who's asking.
Oh, that's cool.
Now, it's interesting because when you look at it, CERN, and the people who go in there are doing scientific work, compartmentalized out in there. We're talking about literally a group among scientists who are aware both of the scientific factor and are aware of the mystical factor. Now, we saw, and I've shown in this program, where those diverged about 1907. Mm-hmm. And they literally kicked out a lot of the metaphysics out of science, even earlier. But in 1907, for sure, they developed psychology to get rid of things like mesmerism and all that. Those people who go into dealing with entities and things like that, one of CERN's specific missions is to tap into other dimensions. How do you think that's going to go? I mean, you have been able to move yourself into psychic states to get information like that. This is not foreign territory to you. But when they're set up around a huge particle collider, I mean, what does the particle collider look like from a psychic state?
Oh, well, with any technology, it's going to take on the energy of the person using it or the people using it.
Okay.
So, I mean, if the consciousness of the people using it are imbalanced, then you can imagine the kind of energy that is going to be created from the technology. And of course, it's a very fast, it's a very intense. So, I mean, when anytime it's ever a technology, the technology is kind of neutral. It's going to take on the shape of whoever's using it. And when I tune into CERN, which I actually haven't done because I really don't like it, I see that there's been something going on for quite a while, longer than we have known, and longer than we have realized, actually. Like, this has been going on for quite a while. And I think they only probably brought it into the public because they had to get certain permissions for other levels and other things.
Yeah.
But I see, I hear screams, and I don't want to like frighten people or anything. That's not my style. But I just see, I see blackness. I see a lot of emotionally, a lot of confusion. I see a chaos. If I were to say it, if I were to just say one thing, it would be chaos and confusion, like chaos realms, lower astral stuff, which is exactly what you would get if you haven't gone through the spiritual processes of cleansing your emotional body, your lower chakras, because the roots of your trees are going to determine how high your branches are going. And if you don't do that work and you start getting really spiritual, then you're going to bring a lot of chaos in. And that's pretty much every spiritual teacher will say that.
That's a good reason to scream. I
see there's some weird imagery with CERN.
Yeah,
absolutely. In the comment section if you have any yourself. But
no, I mean, on the surface, it's very interesting about CERN. Here's a couple of things that really back that up nicely. One, CERN has, because of its budget, its bloated budget, over $8 billion for a scientific project, made other countries look at it as a weapon. They're on record being suspicious it's a weapon. China and India want to build their own particle colliders because they think that's a weapon that's being developed there. Now, so that's not us, sort of pontificating or wondering or conspiring, thinking, CERN is being used for something nasty. China and India are looking at it and saying, we don't like it. So scientists have warned about CERN and these strangelets and the things that could happen, and they've warned about the effects on the magnetosphere. I have to say, the illusions come back to me of the Cayce story in the Atlantean crystal. Now, you are able to look at a pretty vast kind of timeline when looking at these things from a more metaphysical angle. How much does CERN, as something that's in development now, have in common with, say, something that we talked about the last time you were on the show, which is the two-eye crystal that developed into something super destructive in Atlantean times and created all the, mystery school hiding the information and all the rest of it?
I think that it's parallel. I think that we're reaching a parallel time. And I don't think it's necessarily the same technology. I think that Atlantis had a different technology because when I see Atlantis, I see it as actually being in a little bit of a different density and a bit of a different overall energy. And the fall from Atlantis brought us down into a heavier density. So when I look at Atlantis, there's different color spectrums, it's just a different energy. So the technology I don't think is exactly the same, but I think if we're talking about points in consciousness and a level of awareness that we need to have, I think it does parallel Atlantis.
What's fascinating here for me when you say that is density. There's actually a theory that human beings weren't as dense at that point, say going back 100,000 years ago. So just to get a quick snapshot and clarify what you said, are they ethereal bodies? They're not quite fully material human bodies?
Compared to where we are now. So I think that when you're in that state, you perceive yourself as being solid. But I think compared to here, if we were to, it's just very esoteric, but I think if we were to compare it, I think that they would be more ethereal and they would have access. It's like a different state of consciousness. They would have access to like a different type of probably water, air. It would all be a different quality. And that's why I think the people in Atlantis were very psychic. And I think a lot of people were very psychic then, because I think the veil was a lot thinner.
Oh, fascinating. You know, it's really interesting because if you look at the work of Rudolf Steiner, he talks about people being aware in that period of things that were happening 10 miles above them, which is pretty far up if you think about it. That's an unusual state to be in, but it's kind of parallel with what you're saying, which is their consciousness is wide spectrum. They're sort of tuned into everything.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that if we were to look at it in a larger scale, maybe being in a lower density allows us to achieve something greater, because maybe people were in too high of a density, so they couldn't really perceive what was going on. They couldn't really, it was almost like too much of a dream, or it wasn't pressurized enough, wasn't dense enough. And so maybe when Atlantis fell, it fell for a reason. And whenever I tune in, there was always a high probability of Atlantis falling. That's something that's always come to me, was that there were prophets that said, be careful of this time, be careful of this, be careful of that. And it sort of fell, and then these seeds went everywhere. And then everyone started blending together more and more and more. And so we do have this more denser state. When in Atlantis, there was more, everyone was a bit more separate, I think, trying to come together. But now when we come down density, there's more blending and there's more opportunity to unify from, I think, a deeper place. And I think we have more attention to detail. I think the lower the density you go, I think the more attention to detail you have. So there's benefits, I think, spiritually, to being in a lower density. It serves us in a way to, I think, notice detail more than when you're like aware of, everything and you're kind of ungrounded.
Wow. It's interesting. One of the major signatures of the X series and the X Steganography that we're doing has to do with Steiner giving us that information about the mystery schools, saying in 1840, the scientific materialism was taking humanity to a place where within a century, we wouldn't recognize humanity because they'd be so boxed in to this scientific way of thinking that they completely disconnect from that spiritual reality, their spiritual identity. How dangerous is that, what Steiner brought forward about this scientific materialism coming in and the mystery schools releasing this information to counter against that? Where do you think we're at with that?
It's that scientific materialism is that negative shadow side of being too detail oriented, when you're just stuck in one thing and you're just going for it.
You're right.
And you're dogmatic about it. And I think that the mystery schools were right. I think that is the thing that causes a great deal of separation, because people are afraid to not only connect spiritually, but like just emotionally too, because like materialism has managed to wipe out not only the psychic stuff, but like emotional energy now in society. So it really has done a lot, and emotional energy is the medium for psychic energy too. So yeah, I see it as being very detrimental.
How do you, coming from, an intuitive place, how do you deal and work with the technology to its maximum benefit without becoming sucked into the kind of lower aspects of what it is bringing out in the culture?
Yeah, well,
I know. It's a tough thing to solve.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing would be to replace the shamanic class in society. We always used to have a class of shamans or priests and priestesses. Now priests are designated to religions, and that's scary for its own reasons, because it's not for everybody. And in a lot of ways, priests, a lot of stuff going on with that is pretty dark.
Sure.
Yeah.
Especially right now, we're learning a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's no real priest class or shaman class for people. So my first thing would be restore the class of shamans who act as the spiritual heartbeat in society. And when you have that back in society, that vein of energy back in society, these projects don't get off the ground. And what we've done is we've shamed mystics so that there's no voice anymore. And the other good thing too about a shaman class or a priestess class is that they police each other. So you don't get these charlatans that come up and start doing weird things and knocking tables over and things in your ear and you know, like they don't do that, because the moment that you do that, you know, you're out. So I think it's to get this class that we've forgotten about. And that's why I love teaching too, is because we have to bring and awaken people back into the shamanic class and remove all of the stereotypes so that we cannot have things like this going on, including political things too, because it's a spiritual problem we're going through right now.
I see. So blow up Gaia and blow up ABC and get back to normal is what you're saying.
I feel like there was such a great opportunity there, but it just is not.
Well, we see this happens a lot where, you know, there are groups who get together and try to market spirituality. And it's interesting because, you know, spirituality and esoteric development is on a certain level where it should be like any other, you know, merit system or any other financial system where you get what you pay for and all the rest of it. But what happens very often is because it's been marginalized in society, all these different kind of characters can use it as the plaything for their own marketing purposes. And you see marketing purposes and marketing companies move into that space and really kill, you know, any interactive or important insights that could happen. I think it is interesting though, because we stand on the shoulders of mystery schools that came out of the shadows, like Theosophy, like Anthroposophy. And here they were beckoning forward saying, you know, there's going to be another opportunity in about 100 years, in about this period, actually, the 2020 place. How do you feel we're set up to change the paradigm now? Like you said, a lot of the mystical stuff has been shunted into this other category. Although, by the way, behind the scenes, these groups continue to use it and utilize it to the max. I mean, CERN is using it. We've seen all of these different people. You know, President Trump, I mean, John Trump was in the Rad Lab. He knows all about incredibly deep, significant things on the esoteric side. So, you know, a lot of these characters have that knowledge, but it's kind of built in, just like we know the CIA bought and paid for remote viewing for decades. They certainly utilize it, even though in the public they dismiss it.
Oh, it is going on. And that is the joke, actually.
Right.
The joke is that people make fun of psychics. They call us quacks. They call us charlatans. Meanwhile, everybody that you want to be with all the money and all the power is using them because it's augmenting their own abilities, and it never stopped. In regards to how to make a change, it's up to the individual. That's always been the thing. Is it's up to the individual to become interested and to start to see themselves as more than what they are.
Right.
And to do the exercises. I mean, there's no shortage. The blessing that we have is that there is no shortage of books. You mentioned tons of books in your series, and there's tons more. There's no shortage of information, but what we are short on is the desire or the courage to pursue it and the courage to go inward. And I think that that's what's really necessary, is individuals doing that.
Courage, discipline?
Discipline is the biggest. I mean, people love the new age and spirituality as a vacation. like they heal a little bit and then it's a vacation. But if you really want to do this, you really have to be disciplined, and it's not going to be pleasant all the time either. So that's where that discipline comes in.
One of the things that we showed in a couple of X episodes was Gene Dixon's role working with Nixon, presidents from Reagan to FDR, but specifically with Nixon, and how she took part in major, and I mean major, like tension in the Middle East, nuclear negotiations. You know, she was right at the very heart of the decision-making process in some cases. And I called her the most powerful woman in the world at one point. What's interesting about that to me is when we look at these people and we look at these situations, you know, on record, someone who was researching, it came out of Newsweek, actually. Not usually a source that I'm aligned with. But in Newsweek, there was a researcher who was doing 9/11 research, trying to figure out when terrorism first came into vogue for them to research it on a practical level and the types of things that they did. And they found out that the first terrorist task force that was developed was President Nixon. They looked at all these different advisors. And then they looked at someone who had 80 visits to the White House. They said, who's this? It's Gene Dixon. So, you know, I mean, Gene Dixon was a psychic astrologer. So, you know, we know this forms the very heart of geopolitical decision-making. And that's something where they kind of trick you out of your own power or trick you out of your own ability, isn't it?
Yeah, well, the psychic astrology is particularly useful because that allows you to look at those transits and predict those dates.
Right.
You get the climate of things. You know, if Pluto's around, like, that's a no.
Right.
You know?
Right.
You know, it lets you know whether things are stable. So, I mean, Gene would have been, you know, and with intuition, that would have been an incredible asset. Because the cosmos are our mind. They create everything. And if you have somebody that can read those higher patterns, then you are powerful. And I bet every other country has a few Gene Dixons too.
Right, absolutely. It's fascinating because FDR used her, and he specifically used her, one, because he wanted to know how the war was going to end up, and two, how long he was going to be alive, because he had that debilitating illness at the end of his life. So, you know, she started in 44 and gave it all the way up to Reagan. That's 40 years, 4 decades that she documented. So, I mean, that's on record. It's not even something we have to wonder about.
And they kept using her.
Yes, exactly. It fascinates me. And so with that, I'm going to go pretty deep here, actually, on this question. And I know that we've touched on it. I think the information that you provide when you get into tapping into things like that early technology wave, if we are facing a situation like we did in the civilization of Atlantis, where the high technology got split off and the group that wanted to use it for spiritual interaction, spiritual purposes, got dominated by this Belial group, which, you know, like to blow things up. It's Cayce's work and Steiner's work where they say we're coming back into that phase. And they mention reincarnation. And reincarnation is one of the things that they let out of the mystery schools in the 1840s. They let that out, and that was the biggest thing that they were worried about because they didn't know what the impact would be on this Western culture by letting that get into the situation. Groups like Theosophy and Anthroposophy brought it forward, and what they started to say was those groups and those people from Atlantis who went through those technological disasters were coming back and reincarnating. And one of the things that Cayce mentioned in one of the readings was they're coming back from this Atlantean civilization and the civilizations of La, and Da. And everyone has always wondered, oh, we know what Atlantis was. You know, Plato talked about Atlantis. There's all this information relating to it. The hell is La, and Da? And so I asked you to look at this, and you came back with something kind of fascinating, which is this concept of hybrid harmonics. I just wanted you to touch on that a little bit to give us some idea of what that is, hybrid harmonics.
Okay, yeah. So with La, and Da, because I work with psychic energy as well, when you get a psychic hit, it's in a different language. And sometimes if there isn't the right, correct language, it could be just a syllable or a sound because that's the root energy that you're getting. So psychic information is multidimensional. So I think that was an example of like a root sound or a root word that people would have to work on a little bit in order to understand. It wasn't a given. It was a hint. It was a hint at a frequency. La, Da. And what would happen if you meditated on them? I think they were keys. I think they were key harmonics. And a lot of psychics and mystery schools will focus on that. It's like you've said, where they'll give you a part of it. But if that is significant and the process of you understanding that is going to benefit you or society, then you'll just get that little piece. And I think that was a little piece. And the hybrid,
like a little snapshot. It's
a little, because sometimes the process is so much more important than just knowing, well, your was in Sumer or whatever.
Okay, right.
It's that process that we need to go through to discover it, because it means there's something else there or several things there. And so what came through when I was reading it was the idea of the hybrid harmonics, where there's a triangulation of 3 points, one of the points significantly higher, and the joining of all these 3 points creates a stargate. And the force that is creating the stargate is the desire for them to unify, which naturally happens when they're introduced. There's a natural balance that occurs. The X is at the center, and it is the hybrid harmonic of the 3. And so, and then that brought you on to the La Da thing, because you were like, oh my God, I think you remembered something about.
Right. It is, you're right. We started with the X because that's where the hybrid harmonic thing was. And I was like, harmonic. Instantly, I started thinking music. And then I was like, it's weird. That trail from the Cayce reading, La and Da, always sounded like the musical scale to me. And there's a mystery school tradition in the Gurdjieff work, and the musicians in the audience can help us out with this. But between E and F and B and C, in that normal scale of octaves, there is no half step, which is odd in the development of a 12-tone musical scale with 8 major notes. So E and F and B and C don't have that half step. Gurdjieff said, well, that comes out of the Pythagoras, which is basically the main custodian of the Egyptian mystery school. And he said they kept that kind of secret of creation in the musical scale. And then here you were talking about hybrid harmonics, and we see this X steganography everywhere. Suddenly I'm starting to think there's a musical element, that Gurdjieff is pointing to in all of this. So that's the first thing that I got when you said that about the harmonics. I thought it was just right on.
Yeah, and then it was actually, I remember it was, I kept seeing that one of the stargates that I had mentioned was on a 3, 6, 12 cycle, and I kept seeing 3, 6, 12. It was like a dial was set on 3, 6, 12, and the missing harmonic. What if that is the dial? But the 12, that's not included in Gurdjieff. I don't know if that's the higher octave, but
right. No, that is fascinating because, well, it is very interesting when you look at the Enneagram. He talks all about the law of 3. Dealing with the Enneagram. And of course, when you get to 12, you're dealing with some element of 3. It's 4 times 3. So it seems to me that when we're looking at these things, when we're talking about stargates, when you're talking about steganography, when you're talking about maintaining information, in fact, one of the other things that the Gurdjieff school talks about is how when they do these rituals of these dances in the Middle East, like the whirling dervishes, that what they do is the initiates sit back and read the book, and they keep this kind of tradition of the book, just like an oral tradition that's passed down that doesn't get corrupted by writing it down. And that's what the dances represent. So, of course, the dances are dancing to music. So they're keeping moving that steganography there literally through the music. So when we're getting to that, and you said hybrid harmonics, that started to say to me, that's what it leads to. I mean, because there's a whole school of Gurdjieff thought out there about music and how it relates to the mystery school, keeping basically the secrets of creation. So, it's quite fascinating to me that we got into that.
Yeah, and I think everything is music. We just only hear a certain band of music, a band of sound, but I think even people are music. You can hear a person. I know there's some people who are very clairaudient, and they can do their readings by hearing you, hearing your energy. That's how they work. And so everything is music. Everything is sound.
Wow, fascinating. Whenever you get around the Atlantean information or the mystery schools, your information is so fascinating, I have to say. I want to build on this just a little bit and ask you, we've talked about the two-eye stone on this show. This is something that Cayce identified. And I've shown where a NASA scientist came forward in 1974 and came up with a constructed model on paper for what this would look like and all the rest of it. And again, like the La and Da aspect in the Cayce work, the two-eye stone has always been a mystery for people. And we did a show here on the Tua de Danann, who I believe are related to that name. But Cayce took pains to spell the name out, Tuaoi. So he was talking about the group that created the stone. And this was the stone that he said ran all the high technology in Atlantis. This was the advanced technology that they had. When you looked at the 2i, you got a lot of information. Can you just share a little bit of that?
Yeah, about the origins.
Yes.
Okay, so I know people say that the 2i was created by Atlanteans, that they somehow managed to create the stones, but that's just not what I saw. I'm very disagreeable when it comes to some things. Wasn't what I saw. I saw that they actually came from a previous civilization, and the civilization was different than Atlantis because Atlantis has its own qualities and its own characteristics, and every civilization has its own archetypes and characteristics. And for whatever reason, this civilization was really good at merging their consciousness with the earth and creating things. Like that's what they did. It was just very earth-based. And so part of what I saw was that they would create different types of crystals and stones. And part of what they were doing was they knew that these crystals would be used. And they knew that these crystals would determine what would happen on the planet. And so this civilization, I really saw it as creating almost these crystals that were foundational objects. And they would be found at certain times and they would disappear at certain times. But these were kind of like, that was their contribution. And that's what I saw. For whatever reason, I don't know how symbolic this is or literal this is. I also saw the stone coming from the ground, from the center of the earth. And I saw it with a black crust on it, as though it came from, it looked like it came out of a volcano.
Right.
That's just what it looked like. That's just how it appeared to me, like it came up. And I think that it had to get the resonance like of the planet in it. But that's where I saw it come up from. And then I think the crust, I didn't see how the crust came off or if it did or anything, but there was something about some in water. And so it was a whole thing.
Yeah. It is deep, and it's impossible to capture all of the 2i stuff here. But no,
I'm super weird. But yeah, so it was like totally from another. I did not see that it came from Atlantis. They came from another. And the other interesting thing about the crystal that I did see was that the crystal would actually call out to people. That was in line with our consciousness, and this gets into stargates opening and things like that. And that's also why certain people can use it. Is that the people that created these crystals were very, very, very good at what they did, and they were setting the stage. I believe they were setting the stage, and that's where I believe it comes from.
Well, it's so amazing because we have crystals. There's so much crystal power, lasers, and everything else. Crystals basically, they kind of control the entire civilization now, actually. So it's always interesting to me, Cayce's story about this, talking about this in 1920 or whatever, just really setting us up to get us to understand what was happening there. One of the things before we leave the crystal subject, Cayce talked about the 2i at the end as the mighty, terrible crystal. How do you see that?
I think that when he was saying that, it's likely that he was speaking from a place of seeing Atlantis destroyed. And that's, I think, an emotional position. And it's an understandable. But I do not think that it would be a terrible crystal. I think that it's like all technology, it's neutral. And it's going to take on the people who are using it. And that's the reality. It's just going to take on whoever's using it.
Right. So maybe he's capturing the thought form of the people after the fact.
Yeah.
Wow, remember that thing that blew us up.
Or he's heard that, he's heard, in his readings, he's heard it called the terrible crystal by people. And it could even be a key to wake people up. Because you never know when you're doing this kind of stuff. Sometimes people will use very Akashic readings. Sometimes psychics will use very particular words, and it's more about awakening people than it is accuracy. Yeah.
Wow. Figures like Cayce, figures like Emma Britton, and from all indications, Ada Lovelace were using this deep somnambulist trance state to go in and interact with this information, to get this information. You do something very different when you tune in. You don't go into a somnambulist trance.
I know. I mean, the interesting thing about, you know, Emma Britton and these people is I think they had training. And I think they were trained in a way where that was their training. And I'm totally self-developed. So I go into a light trance. If I go into a really deep trance, I can definitely do that. And everything's, it can make it clearer. But then if I come out of trance a little bit, the information differs. So sometimes a deeper trance is very useful if I don't have anything to go on. Like any frequencies to triangulate, then sometimes that's good. Sometimes it's actually necessary to be pulled out a little bit, and you get better information pulled out a little bit. So your trance state is going to determine the quality of information that you get. And it's good to be able to, I think, have your foot on the pedal a bit there.
You mentioned that when you go into those states, there are physical things that happen. And you have to kind of get used to that. What are the kind of effects that you get when you go into the state?
Yeah, so a lot of the time you get hot because you're interfacing with higher energy, whether even though you can't see it, you know, you do have circuitry, you are going into a higher state and you do heat up. You can get really thirsty. You can lots of different, I've known people to actually their muscles to tense up or to start shaking. Some of these things, if they get really bad, it's your sign that you're not balanced enough. And so ideally you want to be very, very, very centered and very, very, very peaceful. And that way there isn't any really, it takes a lot of practice because we don't realize how far away we are from that. But yeah, there's some things that can, and throughout the day, I mean, it's hard to turn off sometimes too, you know, if you forget and you just see people that aren't there, or you see things. So yeah.
That is absolutely fascinating kind of reality for people to imagine. It's almost like being in a dream state.
It is very, and sometimes if you spend too much time there, it's hard to go back into your body. Like I will bump into things and I'm like, oh, I'm not fully here yet. I stubbed my toe 6 times today. I need to, you know. So yeah.
I think it is fascinating. You know, they train these people in different tribes to go into these states, and they have rituals to support them getting into that state so they can get the information and all the rest of it. And when I've seen films of this coming all across from like Indonesia to the Middle East with these different groups, and with the Dogon tribes do this, they literally look, you know, like they're there normal for a while, and then there's this thing in them. Yeah. And it's like a higher, you know, they've kicked into that higher zone, and wow, it's like a different personality completely.
Oh, absolutely. Your brain is actually functioning, it's cycling differently than it was. The personality isn't there as much. So
wow. I am going to actually, Miss Olivia, how are we doing over there?
It's Troll City tonight.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I've had to lead a bunch of people, but I think I've weeded most of them out by now.
I'll tell you what's funny about this is whenever we get around CERN, they show up. They're there.
Oh, really?
It is true, and this is a weird thing. It's when I used to do programs with Dr. Farrell on CERN, we'd get the same problem, and I always say as a reminder, if there are any people from 3-letter agencies using 4-letter words, you get a 5-star spam general. It's over. It's over. Don't even try.
It's true, and I also have noticed that there's some people that are really defensive of CERN, like they don't realize that it's okay to have discussions about the positive things and potentials. It's also okay to have conversations about what could go wrong. This is totally healthy and normal, and they just
this reminds me of people who are like, think Monsanto is a great thing. Like, you know, we have to feed the world, so we have to monkey with the food chain. Don't you get it?
Yeah, there's
yeah. And you know, I remember they got Bono on board, and he was like, yeah, let's bring Monsanto to Africa. You know, so it's easy to talk people into this stuff. And Bono, of course, dumped his terrible album to everyone for free, and he forced it onto my iPhone. This is my Bono aside.
Can I throw Gigi a crazy question?
Throw it my way.
Okay, so Jake Farron Merlin says, have you ever encountered a reptilian entity? I would love to know the answer to that.
Hello, Merlin. Yeah, absolutely. I worked as a practicing psychic for quite a while, and I saw all kinds of things. And I have seen reptilian beings. I've seen them when they are not so lovely, and I've also seen ones that are very lovely. A lot of people feel very negative towards types of extraterrestrials, and it's really important to remain neutral because we can't project our ideas on them and things like that. But I have seen reptilian beings and all different types of interdimensional beings.
Well, it's fascinating to me too, because when you go into those different states, I remember this fascinating thing from Graham Hancock, where Graham does these ayahuasca sessions. And ayahuasca is that thing, you know, there's all kinds of advice out there about it, which is, you know, you really need to be serious if you're going to deal with it. But one of the things that's fascinating is, you know, Graham Hancock does not get into the ET subject at all. And we've talked at length about this. It's not, he thinks that, like, you know, a lot of that is overblown. And he definitely thinks that people are looking for a nuts and bolts kind of ET reality and projecting kind of this anthropomorphic thought form onto this idea of space. What's fascinating to me is if you read his books dealing with his states of ayahuasca, when he goes into those states, he sees reptilians, he sees grays, he sees all that kind of thing when he's in those unusual states. And, you know, Olivia and I were at one of his conferences where he talked about this kind of reptilian statue come alive, you know, and then it looked at him, it like popped its eyes open and looked at him while he was in that state. And you know, you just think to yourself, you know, he's gone into it for a higher meditative state. This is not like a bad trip, but whoa, you know. So when you go in there, you're subject to all these different types of impressions.
Yeah, and I think that there's so much about our consciousness that we don't know. Right. And it's so important to stay open and playful. And also that anthropomorphic thing may kind of be true. Maybe we perceive an energy field and we create it as we see it. But that could actually be what's going on when we perceive higher energy, is we automatically put a filter on it. That could be true. But people, no matter where they are on the planet, unrelated, tribes, civilizations, have seen the same thing. So no matter what it actually is, there's some frequency that we're picking up on that we interpret as that. And so we can look at it that way as well. It doesn't have to be so solid. We can apply that anthropomorphic thing to it. Like the mantis beings, like you said, some people see them as mantis beings. Some people see them, this is really silly, but some people see them as like a spring onion. And I know that's super crazy, like kind of like a head.
Oh,
and they flip back and forth. And it's like, so there's obviously something very wistful about this that we don't yet understand. So,
well, we talked about Alice in Wonderland, and Alice in Wonderland is full of that imagery, but the Alice in Wonderland is largely based on Emma Britton's experience in the Orphic Circle. So what does that tell us?
Exactly. I think we have to, we don't know very much. We don't know very much, but there are some constants that we have. And I think that there are some beings that for whatever reason are a constant. So for whatever reason.
Wow. I'm going to show this to everyone, actually. I came across this recently, which is a page out of the original book, which was not published. He reformed it, which it was going to be, you know, what became Alice's Adventures in Wonderland was originally called Alice's Adventures Underground. And this is an original page from Lewis Carroll. And that's his writing there, putting this book together in 1859. Just fascinating. I thought that's a good jump-off point for us to go to Miss Olivia with her questions. What do you got, Olivia?
Okay, well, I did want to ask Gigi, you seem to have some sort of connection to lion beings. What is that all about?
Yeah, I do. One of the
we had the lion thing today.
I do. I don't actually fully understand what it's about, and that happens with probably about the majority of my work. And And you're always in this place of, and you have to be comfortable in this place of not knowing. And so I don't fully know, but I get pieces. And so one of the first, when I started to psychically open, one of the first things I saw was what was a lion being, which is a being with a lion, like a lion head, but it's a human. And it was blue. And I would see it, and it would come. It was kind of like a protector spirit guide. I don't have any normal spirit guides. I just have ETs.
Right.
That should be known. And
no Native American chiefs, as you're fond of saying. There's nothing traditional about you and your psychic experience.
No, not so much. And I just, I don't know. But yeah, that was like some people have an experience where they have like a nurse as their spirit guide, or you know, a priestess, and mine would be a lion being. And
well,
so it always says something about you, no matter who your spirit guide is. It always says something about you. It's never random. So
okay.
I forget the name of the goddess in Egypt that has the lion head. Have you done any research on that?
Yeah, there's a bunch. There's Bath, Sekhmet, and then there's Inanna. There's a lot of different goddesses, a lot of them associated with Venus, that have a lion.
Mm-hmm. Do you have you ever picked up psychically that you have been a priestess in Egypt before? Maybe a priestess of that particular goddess?
I haven't connected too much with Egypt. Maybe that's in the future.
Okay, because I'll tell you intuitively, I feel that's very strong around you.
Oh,
And that could even be our past life connection.
Wow, absolutely.
Who knows?
Well, we're Egypt freaks here. There's no question about it. Mm-hmm. Okay, what do you got, Olivia?
Okay, well, Medley Childress wants to know, do you ever get frightened by anything that you see?
Frightened.
You know what? I have to be honest. There's a shock. Sometimes when you see things, there's a shock to it. And part of developing your intuition is experiencing the shock and then letting it go and just being there with it, because you understand that no matter what you see, your core is always in control. You can shift out of whatever, and it's all kind of flexible. So with that, there's a shock to it, but then you learn how to handle these situations, so you transform them into something else, and that's the practice.
Wow, it's fascinating. I want to remind everyone that you're watching Dark Journalists. I want to remind everyone to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter. That's the best way for us to stay in touch and for you to understand what shows are coming up. And basically what happens is you're going to get one about once a week in your inbox, and just letting you know the X series is coming on Friday and who the guest is and all the rest of it. That's an important thing, though, because with the social media networks, we're here today, and who knows what tomorrow may bring. We're talking with Gigi Young. Gigi has an exciting course on intuitive development, and she's at gigiyoung.com. Her videos are available on YouTube. Incredible range of ideas that you touch upon in your work, and I've always enjoyed your videos. They're always deep on the subjects, and what I want to do is I want, Olivia, if you can bring out any questions that relate to kind of what we've been talking about in that first hour, CERN, Atlantis, and that range. If you can give us some of those now, that would be fantastic.
I'm going to get over there eventually. I have a few more. I have a few that I have lined up here that I want to ask first. Okay, so easy one. Bo Krills is asking, is Gigi RH negative?
Oh, there you go.
I do not reveal.
There you go.
Okay,
yes.
Good for you.
Good answer.
So Cold Aussie wants to know if you feel that the destruction of Atlantis is what dissipated magic in the modern world.
Yeah, I think that everything kind of happens in cycles. And I think that if you saw your society fall because people were messing around with things, I think you might have a little bit of a bad taste in your mouth about it. I think that's understandable. I know that a lot of people have a collective shock in their system with this. And I think that could be part of it. So absolutely. I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, yeah, that's fascinating. I will say this in relation to Atlantis, which is what you were talking about, you know, is their density changed?
Mm-hmm.
And also, one of the things that Cayce points out is when they moved from Atlantis to Egypt and the Yucatan and the Pyrenees and all the rest of it, those groups wanted to hide away what was left of the advanced technology part. So there were echoes. There started to be echoes, kind of like if we had a nuclear blast now, people would remember the iPhone or whatever. Maybe a small group would still maintain that information that had like a bomb shelter in Silicon Valley. But when you get right down to it, the average person probably knows maybe about how 1% of the technology that they use on a daily basis, how it works. You know, like we understand the fountain pen maybe pretty well. So it's really a small group that keeps that information. And once it cycles out of the society goes back to kind of agrarian existence. And so it's a very different thing. So in that sense, they lose the kind of legacy of those cultures, you know, and it goes underground for centuries.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also this weird phenomena that occurs, and it really bothers me, where a lot of the really great mystics are quiet. And some of the really, really ones that are kind of darker and can't really tap in very well, and they just mess around in the lower astral and like ruin people's lives and stuff. Those are the ones that are like, buy my stuff. Like, hey, you know, and it bothers me because some of the best psychics are so quiet. They're not making YouTube videos, but they're so good. And people don't experience that because they're off in their garden, you know, and they're doing their mystical thing. And so people also don't have good examples of what mystics are. They just see these people who are very shallow, a shallow mystic, which is like, yeah, you can go into the astral and tap into what's already done.
Right.
You're not creating anything. You're not, you know, so what are you contributing, right?
Absolutely. Well, it's fascinating. And I want to say this in regards to you, which is I think we're very lucky to have you out there because you also don't like the spotlight a whole heck of a lot, I've noticed.
No, I really feel, I always feel reluctant. I always kind of feel reluctant about it. I would much rather be in my own, I feel like there's a part of me that would much rather be in my own space. So I definitely am kind of overcoming, I would say.
Yeah. No, this is a great thing. But I understand exactly what you're talking about. Look, when we speak about Edgar Cayce, for example, Edgar Cayce until 1941 was largely unknown. And he only lived till 1945. A book called There's a River came out about his life and all of his readings and all the things that he did. And that's how we kind of got to know about him. In his own life, he went reading to reading. You know, he was a photographer. That was what he did basically to pay the bills. This wasn't a guy on a superstar circuit or doing, you know, TV or radio and all the rest of it because they didn't even have TV then. So that gets passed down to us. And after he died, there was a big commercial explosion around his work, The Sleeping Prophet and all the rest of it. But it's fascinating when you really think about it. 70, 80 years ago, Cayce died. And it's really only for 4 years in his own life that he's well known. So
yeah, you never got to see the impact of like what he did in that body, in that life. And that, I think that's one of the most amazing things about our time is that I think mystics can do that is they get to see what their impact is. Because that's how you really, I think, get to know who you are, is by how people respond to you. And maybe he didn't get to see, maybe he is from the other side, but that is really, and maybe he needed that kind of privacy to work though.
Yeah.
He was really esoteric and that's hard.
Right.
You don't have many reference points. So
I like what you're getting at, which is a lot of the esoteric development, the spiritual, psychic that's available, that kind of material that's available now, people doing it now, probably, honestly, if we're going to size it up, it's pretty superficial. You know, I was somebody who said that a lot of these topics had kind of hit rock bottom in terms of how they were presented to the public because they'd been manipulated on one side by intelligence agencies and on the other side by unscrupulous marketing forces, and that there's a very narrow, thin beam down the middle corridor for the good, genuine information to come through. And I think that's still the condition, the nature of the situation now.
I think, yeah, I see that too. And I would say that there's a really intense initiation going on because something
Right.
happens when you market yourself as an intuitive when you're not prepared to handle all of the readings or all of the opportunities that come your way. Like if someone puts you on the spot and you crumble, then that's kind of what you're setting yourself up for. It's very hard to genuinely, people are really forgetting the backbone of psychic work, which is you have to probably know something about astrology. You probably have to know something about symbology and archetypes because that's how spirit communicates. You probably should know something about the Eastern religions or you need to have certain backbones. And a lot of people go into this with no backbone, with no traditional practices. And that is not only bad for society, but it's bad for the mystic because once you pressurize yourself, you won't know how to handle things.
Right.
And so that's not good.
Wow. Fascinating. Miss Olivia.
So Michael Wisdom wants to know, is CERN secretly messing around with the fire crystals?
I've never seen, honestly, I don't peer around at CERN too much because I don't want CERN to peer around at me.
Yes. Yes. This is a
be
little bit of, what is that Sauron thing in
Yeah.
Lord of the Rings, which is, yeah, you can look at them, but they can look back at you too.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, one of the reasons why I started getting a lot of information with CERN was because of ancestry connections that I discovered. And so I used that as my insulator and I used that as my pull. But if I were to just go and start viewing things, they can view me. And there's an opening there. So I have to be psychic. And, if you're psychic and you're doing things, you got to know that if you open yourself and you want to poke around, then people can poke around on you. There's certain windows and certain things you have to know. So I don't do too much. I read the surface of whatever's right, I'll say.
This is fascinating to me, and I have to bring this up. This is really, really edgy too.
Okay.
When I did some work with Rick Thurston, who was a fantastic channel, and in many ways, he made this prediction about a mass sighting over New York City on October 13th, 2010, actually. And there's a whole kind of story about my interaction with this guy over time, and he passed away. One of the fascinating things that he put on record when I was talking with him was he talked about how in Nostradamus' time, the way he could get a lot of information about the future was that he literally could interact and talk with someone from the future, that they had a kind of alchemical means to do this in the Middle Ages from where he was practicing, that end of the mystery schools. And that really stumped me because I was like, what on earth is this? This is really interesting. And then you said something which touched on this, which was that, we know, and we're going to do a full, because of the information I'm accumulating about the Corsons, and which is your whole family line. And we touched on it a little bit last time. And we're going to go deeper with the whole show about the Corsons because they're in the middle of Theosophy, they're in the middle of the Rad Lab, and they come up in strange geopolitical situations like the JFK assassination. I mean, you're in a very interesting stream there, Gigi, and you landed right in the middle of the X series with it, which I found fascinating because, that whole development of CERN comes right in through the Corson line, as we know.
Yeah.
So, for better or worse, that is an interesting way to tap into it. Here's my question for you, though. What Rick Thurston told me is something that you've kind of correlated a little bit also, which is at times you've gotten the impression that there was somebody back in time trying to communicate with you when you were in certain states. And I've heard this before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah. So I've had it happen twice. Once was unconsciously, and then one time I went back to bug that person. So this is probably very abstract to some people, but when you get into psychic play, it's really cool. So yeah, I meditate every morning and I meditate every night and I do yoga to stay in my body. And so it was after that, and I could hear someone talking, and I got the impression that someone was trying to reach me, but they didn't know the signal or whatever. And for how I work is I see things in layers and bands, and I get to know what the band is, like what resonance the band is, and I can tell who it is sometimes. I know it's strange, but that's how I do it. And I knew that this one was a ancestor because it felt that way in my body and to me. And so there was, and then the visuals came, and there was like a man from way back in the day who was actively trying to communicate someone in his family line at this time in the future who had the capability to hear, see, and feel that level of energy.
And you had the impression that they needed to do it through a family line in order to get a hint of communication.
That was the most consistent energy. So if you do it through a lineage, then that's what they are. That's what they're vibrating. So they can use it and project it, and they can create a line. That's how it was shown to me. But there's a lot of experimentation. Like when this person was connecting with me, this person didn't know if they were going to reach, who they were going to reach. Because I think that the triangulation was this point in time, which was parallel to the fall of Atlantis, and it's the ascension cycle, if you want to use New Age language, things like that. They wanted that period of time, and then they wanted someone in their line, I think, that was sensitive. That's what I think the triangulation was. And then I got it. I don't know if other people got it, but I got it.
Wow.
And I just got, yeah.
So I think it's incredible because there is that thing that comes through so often, which is all time is one time. You know, there is no time, there is no space. That's a pretty deep level to tap into. But anyone who's ever had a prophetic dream, for example, indicates the idea that these things are already occurring long before we take them in.
Oh yeah, definitely. And once you get out of 3D, time happens according to resonance. So the resonances that you create, the thoughts that you have, the emotions that you feel, that is more the determining factor of where you are in time. And mystics can get very, very good at this, but the secret is that you have to really learn your energy, what your heart feels like, because your heart's the middle point. So you have to learn who you are and what your energy feels like, and then you can travel, because you can always kind of come back to yourself and you have a reference point. But you can do all kinds of things psychically to do with time if you just understand resonance and how it works.
Wow. Miss Olivia.
Hold on. There's a great kind of three-part question.
I like it.
So Najat is asking if you think that they are trying to awaken or connect to Ahriman through CERN. Joan Gogol says, I think CERN is one of Ahriman's control panels. And Diane Walker said, CERN creating colder than space. Is that to usher in the age of Ahriman?
Well, I'm going to mention one thing about space, and then I want Gigi to tackle those. One thing, though, I've done interviews with Elena Freeland and someone I've spoken with deeply on technology, and she knows so much about the scientific aspects relating to the space fence and the HARP and these developments of geoengineering. Her impression of D-Wave, which is the quantum computing chip, and you know, whenever you see the pictures around it, people are standing there like high priests, kind of holding this vigil around this incredible chip. And we've talked about how the language around it, you know, that even normal scientific types start to talk in this adoring language about what an incredible gift bringer this chip is. But there's an odd thing about that chip, which is it has to be held in, because it does its quantum computing, it has to be held in a temperature that's colder than space. And when I think about Steiner talking about Ahriman and how, you know, Ahriman is technology and he is preparing an incarnation in this millennium, in the, you know, this is the century where he is going to appear. I think of Ahriman manifesting through technology. I don't think of him having a physical incarnation through a human body. But that's my take on it. Ahriman and CERN, Gigi, how do you see that?
Yeah, well, I think that the concept of Ahriman is so interesting because one thing that I think people like to do is they don't like to take the idea of pure malevolence and personify it.
Right.
But when you do personify it, it allows you to understand it more. And I think that's what Steiner's done, is he's personified something so that we can understand it.
Okay, yes.
Because I know that there's some people in the New Age or in the spiritual scene that don't like to go to that level because it's like a superstition. So it's important to know that, you know, Armin's the personification of basically malevolence, of evil, right? And that means that they want to take every opportunity and destroy rather than create. That's just what it is. It's, you know, so.
Right, absolutely. Well, it's interesting with Steiner. He does not say run from Ahriman. What he says is that humanity, spiritual science, anthroposophy, the mystery schools, was meant to create a platform of ideas and experiences and knowledge to meet it, to face it head on and pass through it and kind of come out on the other side. So it wasn't like run from the devil. It's like, let's hit it straight on. But even, I remember your first reaction when you looked at Ahriman and you were like, whoa, immediately you jumped on that one.
Yeah, I did not like the look of that thing.
And it's interesting because Ahriman, you know, Steiner sculpted that after doing that kind of meditation that you're talking about. He went into that deep state and he said that what he felt was things were getting rigidified. He felt like he was walking in concrete.
He was engrossing himself. He was engrossing himself in that frequency and then, you know, letting it affect him so that he could come back and describe it so that people could be aware of it. That's a great mystic, right? That embodies things. That's what they're for. That's what they're for. But when it comes to CERN, like I really can't pound the drum enough that I really believe that all technology is neutral, and it's the people that we have to be concerned about. Certain people in society that need help. And
oh yeah, absolutely, I agree with you, and I'd get on that as well. It's not, the idea isn't to create a boogeyman. You know, as we see a lot of clickbait around CERN will do that. It's like CERN's bringing in the, you know, the devil's horde or whatever. It is this whole, you know, it's kind of there's a whole industry, kind of a cottage industry around that. I think what's legitimate is this. We've seen mysteries with CERN relating to their budget. We've seen strange mysteries relating to CERN and occult activities. It's just on the record. I mean, the security footage caught a whole ritual going down at CERN in their own work, in their own tarot cards of their artist in residence. You know, this, that's, you know, that looks like saucers, right? I mean, that's the UFO file there. And so there is this element around it, and there's no denying it, I think. So that kind of thing, whether or not what it is used for ultimately is definitely a good question. But the idea that we get on the same level, I think this is what's important, maybe, that we get on the same level, understanding that the mystery schools had information dealing with a whole different kind of science, a whole different level of science relating to this sphere of psychic experience that you're talking about. And that small groups within the scientific world understand that and work with it, even while they deny it and disparage it in public. So that if we crack into that information, then we get a much better level, a much better lens to look at them and see what they're up to. We get a much, you know, it's more like a level playing field. That's what we need. That's the kind of transparency I think that's required. So that's a good question. Okay, what else you got?
Kids Future wants to know, have there been UFOs seen over CERN?
This is an excellent question. I've heard about unusual activity around CERN. I haven't heard about active UFO sightings. There might be videos that include that. It hasn't come up much. What else you got?
Follow up on that one. Justin Thomas wants to know if the alien agenda is compartmentalized and has humanity building their machine without realizing it.
Gigi, it's a question with Gigi written all over it.
The alien agenda. I don't know. Is it the agenda where they're building the humans?
Well, this is the idea, maybe, that these alien races are looking at us as a kind of a third world country to develop, and that they're coming in and using us to develop their stuff, basically, for their own opportunist reasons. There are people out there who are mystics, like Ingo Swann, that the CIA used in remote viewing programs. And when he was asked, what do the aliens use, what's the whole UFO thing using the Earth for? And he said it's a supermarket. So what do you think of all that? I mean, it might be a negative connotation, but is that something that you think takes place when you see all these massive sightings going on across the world? And if we attribute them to an off-world civilization, what do you think they're doing?
I think that a lot of the crafts are ours.
Yes.
And I think that some people are seeing crafts, and I think that they're not actually ET crafts, because our technology is so advanced. A lot of the crafts that are genuinely ET are often light or plasma. There's a lot of that going on because aliens are really interdimensional beings from different worlds. And that's really how I see it and I look at it. And you really can't have, to be completely honest, you really can't have an alien agenda, because there's so many different types of beings that interact with our world for different types of purposes. Some are completely neutral. They just observe. Some are very loving and high and benevolent and have been involved in our seeding and our process of creation before we were even humans, have been involved in the earth. And there are some lower density beings that are also involved and have done nasty things or have tried to do things. So you really have a full gamut, and it's really important to keep your idea of extraterrestrial consciousness open like that. Because when you start getting into interdimensional beings, what you believe is what you're going to attract. And it's going to be the bandwidth in which or the frequency in which you perceive. And that's so true with psychic stuff. So you really just want to keep things very open. You want to educate yourself on all different types of things, because you really don't want to become really entrenched in that kind of idea about extraterrestrial and interdimensional beings, because you will really cut yourself off.
Right. It's almost like the esoteric information, the information left by the mystery schools. There's so much there that teaches you about yourself. And I always say that when you get to that whole UFO file, like, you're kind of like, it would be like dealing with a peer. So this idea that you'd be saved, or it's a savior race and you're all set once the aliens land or disclosure happens, is actually completely wrong. Because the idea would be, you would need to use the tools that these esoteric groups have left behind for your own self-development.
And there's no saving. And this seems to be, like, in my opinion, that's always a wave. There's always a wave in the spiritual scene where there's going to be landings and there's going to be saving, and you're not going to have to take responsibility for anything, and you're going to be taken off world. And there's all that narrative has been there for 60 years. I've seen it around. And I do feel like that's a distraction, because it's really about grounding and knowing yourself. And yes, we are connected to higher beings, and yes, it's fun and it's fascinating. But it's really, you have to save yourself, and that's why we're here.
Absolutely. Miss Olivia.
This one's for you, DJ. Marie Oliver, can you please review Ada's lineage? How far back can we track her?
Well, it's interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There's, when you look at Byron, Lord Byron, his whole background on his mother's side is Scottish royalty. And what it says to me is that, he's somebody who's passed down in that lineage. Remember that Ada's his only legitimate daughter, that he had illegitimate children, but she's the only one that came out of his marriage. And her mother, I remember, was a mathematician. And so she had all these qualities that she passed down to her, and she was worried so much about Ada, and that Ada would take on the crazy Byron aspects, because Byron's dad had this same type of quality. And when they talk about them being crazy and like having multiple personalities and causing scandals and all this stuff, you know, sometimes psychic energy works like that too, when people are just completely, you know, over the top. And there's a factor there that I think that they were trying to harness with Ada, which is that she had this incredible ability passed down. Because if you look at the life of Byron, I mean, it's pretty remarkable. People could just say, well, this guy's a swindler, a charlatan, and a womanizer, and, you know, whatever it happened to be. But there he is fighting for Greek independence against the Ottoman Empire also, and writing these incredibly influential books and poetry, the most magical stuff you probably ever read in your life. And influencing Shelley to write Frankenstein. And what is Frankenstein? I mean, Frankenstein is the heart of the CERN question for me. If you read Frankenstein, I think you understand CERN, because those groups and those people that came in at that period, they're setting up this entire, you know, I wish in a way that we had some of them now, because they are guided by such a vision of the future, even if their lives are chaotic or compromised. But I will say this, that they seem to be operating all in this kind of elite group, you know, and this is where you get the Orphic Circle. Remember Emma Britton's comment relating to it was, everywhere I looked around, there were noblemen. There was Dickens, there was Disraeli, there was the Prime Minister of Britain. You know, these were incredibly high elite circles. And there's no question that Ada Lovelace was right in the heart of it, being Byron's legitimate daughter. Wow, though, incredible background. Okay.
Okay. So David Tormita wants to know, Gigi, what is your advice for dealing with the frequencies that are emanating from places like CERN? And Tu Beretta wants to know, do you think that CERN could be having an effect on our dream states?
Oh, really good questions.
Yeah.
What were we going to say?
Well, I was just going to say dreams. Why don't you start with dreams? You get a lot with dreams, I think.
Yeah, dreaming is like your time to really enmesh with your subconscious. And the best thing to do with dreams is to train yourself to use that time productively. I don't think that everyone is necessarily going to get nightmares or have their dream states negatively affected by something like CERN or even technologies in general, because it's not really just CERN. There's a lot of questionable technologies that we need to discuss. So there's a lot of things going on with AI and technology that we just need to talk about, because we don't really know and haven't had enough like professional expert people talk about it yet.
We have to bring it into the conversation and not in this kind of wild, you know, fly-by-night way that you see in certain corners of alternative media. And you can't have the neglect thing. Everything's hunky-dory from the mainstream media, which is like, don't look at anything, don't talk about anything except, you know, some political thing that you need to get upset about, or Stormy Daniels. Right?
Exactly. Like, we need real educated scientists, mystics, people just having a conversation, balanced conversation about it. That's what we really need, because we actually don't know how these technologies affect our consciousness, really. I can perceive part of it, but we need more mystics to come forward and say, well, this is what I see, and this is what I see. And it's, you know, or, you know, this needs to happen very, very, very badly, because a lot of people want to know how their consciousness is affected by it. The one thing that is going to be the best thing that you can do is to have a strong meditation practice and to start merging yourself back into your spirit through presence. If you look at any mystical tradition, a lot of it is about meditation and creating coherence in your body. Because when you're coherent and you have that, when you are the 0 point, I'll just say, when you're the 0 point, and that's by unifying as much as possible, things can't get in. And that's the best psychic self-defense. It's not so much about protection, although there's tons of great protection visualizations that can give you an edge and are wonderful, and I use them. But the best thing you want is a good offense, period. Like, you want to get good at harmonizing your energy and listening. That means listening to your emotions. And are you in a bad mood? How can you get that back to neutral? and all these beautiful practices. And what that does is it doesn't allow, because when you have a good harmonic going on, it doesn't allow anything in. And so that's what you want. You want to get yourself humming so succinctly as much as possible that these things don't really affect you. And that actually disempowers people that go into the collective looking for your fear or looking for your depression or looking for your anxiety, because those kind of energies feed a collective and certain entities that are in the collective. And so not only are you protecting yourself, you're also starving and limiting energy. Energy is energy. So you're limiting that quality of energy contributing to the collective.
Oh, this is great. You know, fascinating. And it's the grounded, centered message. I remember a couple of years ago, Olivia and I were tracking this phenomena of Pokemon, and we would see people wander into the middle of streets with oncoming cars looking for a Pokemon. And I was just thinking, you grew up with that cell phone, now you sucked into it, and now you're just a part of that thing, and it's going to wipe you out. It's going to wipe out your physical existence, because you're going to be standing in the middle of a train, you know, a road looking for a Pokemon, and the car is going to run you over. I mean, it was fascinating. It was an absolute thing. And I just waited for the craze to end, and I thought, hey, this is a little, you know, I think they tried this out. This is kind of an op that they tried for a little while. This is pretty good.
That's scary. I mean, I saw a little bit of that, and I was like, oh, that's good. They're trying to get people out of the house and in the sun. But then it's so weird to see someone outside and not even remotely interested in being outside. So,
I think all of what you just said, by the way, if people have questions about 5G, go back and listen to what Gigi's just laid out there about being centered and these things that are happening with technology. There are technologies that are coming into these communities. These communities are fighting back, but it's interesting because what you hear from Gigi is the same type of thing that you hear from Catherine Austin Fitts, which is if you're coherent to start with, your odds of dealing with these things and these developments that are coming down, you know, and trying to experiment, sort of harvest the culture, if you're coming from that centered place, you have a much better shot. Okay, Miss Olivia.
Janine London, please address the rituals and symbolism presented in the creation of the CERN facility.
oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, look, CERN was created as a nuclear agency in Europe in 1959. And I've outlined that John J. McCloy, who was on the board and the president of Citibank, which is the Rockefeller-controlled bank, those were his connections. I mean, he's a Wall Street guy, and he was involved in the whole reconstruction of Germany, and he was involved in the Warren Commission, and the whitewash around the Warren Commission. So you can see right off the bat, you know, you've got some problems with CERN right off the bat. In my I still recommend my videos with Joseph Farrell on this, which is CERN Apotheosis, that whole series that we did 4 videos. What it comes down to really is the creation of it as a nuclear agency gave it a kind of cover, and that by the time they got into the 2000s, then they could announce this Large Hadron Collider particle facility, which is the largest particle physics laboratory in the world. So, by the way, we have them here. We have them in Long Island, on the East Coast here. They certainly, you know, and like I said, the Varian brothers developed them along with what I call Gigi's uncle, Dale. He was really big. I mean, as a matter of fact, they developed the klystron, and he developed the other piece that made CERN go. So, you know, I mean, that's the root of it. Is in the Rad Lab. That's what they were doing. I can show you an ad the Varian brothers ran before this technology went into the Rad Lab and kind of underground, where they were selling particle accelerators in 1938. And they were doing this to kind of fund their business. And they were like, hey, we'll sell them. Exactly.
Your house?
Yeah, I have a picture of one of the portable ones. I don't have the ad, unfortunately. I wish I did. No, actually, I don't have it handy, but it is quite interesting because there it is, this little kind of, it looks like a vacuum cleaner. I mean, you know, and that literally is what they wound up using for deep space radar. I mean, they had really tripped into the technology. So when you get right down to it, the particle accelerators, that's the root of it. Dale Corson's work is credited deeply with developing that. And the Varian brothers, who were out of the Halcyon Temple for Theosophy in California. I mean, it's undeniable. It's on the record. So if you want the roots of CERN, and again, you know, the Varians had incredibly high ideals. These are not people looking to dominate the world. However, could someone take their invention and try to dominate the world with it? That's different, you know. Some of those incredible people in the Rad Lab, like Oppenheimer, I mean, he developed the atomic bomb, but you can see that he had a conscience, and he didn't like where this was going. And he would quote Vedic scripture because he understood, you know, he said, now I've become a destroyer of worlds, quoting that Vedic Upanishad. So when you look at that, this is the balance that we're talking about, which is these people can bring these things in and they can develop the culture, and we can get this incredible technology, but is the culture ready for it? Or are we still ruled by these corporate overlords who, you know, want to just use that to harvest humanity and dominate the scene? I mean, this is what we've seen. This is where we're at in the 21st century. We still haven't gotten over the domination mentality. There's no question about it.
The symbols are great, though, because there's that picture of, is it Kali?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah, that's one of the symbols that they use, and that's an interesting choice, I would say, for a
noble scientific venture. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the place is loaded. The logo is loaded with very unusual occult imagery, and a lot of people thought, oh, it's 666 because of the thing. And actually, what Dr. Farrell, who spent a lot of time looking into this, he said, no, it's 999, which is another kind of occult end of the spectrum. No, there's no doubt that we don't have to project something occult onto CERN. It's there. It's definitely there, which makes it even stranger in a sense. It's got that, like, there's something almost arrogant about CERN that I think people, when they look at it, they get that impression, like, it doesn't seem very trustworthy. And the scientists who try to sue it had that very same impression. And the case, if you want to look it up, took place in Hawaii, actually. And they were scientists who had tracked the effect on the magnetosphere when CERN was turned on. And they legitimately felt that it was a hazard to the environment, at the very least. So, no, I think we're going to be hearing more about CERN as we go along here. And the fact that they developed the Alice particle accelerator now, and they have certain aspects of that, like, you know, they have this one part of it that's called the Rabbit Underground. I mean, you know, it's Alice in Wonderland imagery that came out of the Orphic Circle. So there is this weird, like, thing when we get around CERN, we're tapping directly into this metaphysical scientific thing. And it's a dark to light situation, because when you get into these situations, one of the things that you pointed out to me, Gigi, was that some of those people are just out of the loop. They're just scientists. They have no idea about the occult side.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that they need to, because I think that that's what is going to give people really good, innovative ideas. And it's almost like there's a group of people that almost parasitically maybe use spiritual ideas, not fully understanding them, but parasitically use them and became obsessed and entranced. And it kind of seems like that's what's going on. And you know what, if I had to say something about it and the symbology, because I do think that there's symbols that are used for CERN that we don't see, that focuses consciousness, because when you start getting into particles and things like that, the symbols matter. And so I think that I think that it's not done correctly. Like, that's my impression. I think that what you're speaking about is significant in that if you don't really have the connection yourself, I don't think that the technology is going to be created properly. And so I think that that's part of CERN that we maybe haven't realized yet or we don't know yet, but I don't think it's as succinct as a machine as we're so overwhelmed by it. But I think there's another layer there where maybe it's not working the way that it could, or I do feel that there's something about it that's not functioning properly. I don't know if you're picking that up, but
yes,
that's what I feel.
Absolutely. No, it's a good observation, actually, which is you're saying whatever it is they're trying to do, not just on the scientific level, but more on like a metaphysical level, that's flawed. And
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think that there's a big flaw with it because you have to consider, you know, who is using it, and all these different factors go into it. And if the spirituality and the that level isn't there, then it's just not going to be possible to create something that is in like really, really at a high level. There's going to be something going on with it because you don't have that sight. Even if you have people, it's just there's a threshold.
Absolutely. Wow. Miss Olivia.
Dan Lopez 2012 wants to know, Edgar Cayce identified 999 with the real number of the beast. Is that true?
Well, I mean, that's not from a reading that I'm familiar with. So you'd have to cite what the reading numbers are. And I'll tell you, I know the readings pretty well. So if you cite the number of the reading, it's pretty easy for me to get access to it. But no, I've never heard that.
Okay.
999 does come up, however, in Golden Dawn type imagery. So it is an occult number. There's no doubt about that. But I've never seen Cayce associated with it.
Okay. David Donaway wants to know, does Gigi see the money controllers as high adepts on the dark side?
The money controllers. I think some are.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think some probably have like severe addictions to power, to sex, to substances, to whatever. I think some are intentionally dark and fascinated with the occult. I think it's probably a bit of a mixed bag. I don't think everybody is. I don't think that there's necessarily a group that meets every Wednesday that burns black candles and chants into the night. Like they all get together. Like I don't really, I know that's the imagery, but I think that it's a bit more haphazard than that. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I do think that there's people that try to gain influence and power, especially money, through darker means.
Absolutely.
Gigi, this question is for me around this. So this community is really obsessed with the dark side, what's hidden on the dark side, I find. And I don't know if it's serving us. I mean, it's there, it's undeniable, but I feel like we could be spending a lot more of our time and energy connecting to the light side, connecting to our own higher natures. And I wonder what you think about that.
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree. There's an addictive quality to the lower astral. It's like an overstimulation sometimes.
Well, it's not fear, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that that's sometimes why people get so obsessed with looking at this kind of stuff. It's not even because they genuinely want to, it's because they have to, because there's a stimulation of the nervous system. And it's a problem that when we're children, we're not really taught to meditate, and we're not really taught how to connect with our own energy. So the moment that we get these stimulations and stuff, we become addicted to that, or there's things that, you know, we want that. And so I think part of it is I think that you're absolutely right. And I think it's kind of more of an obsession. And I think that when we have to kind of come back to 0 point again, where it's like, whenever you look into the darkness, you're always going to find an aspect of yourself there. And that's the purpose of darkness, the purpose of looking into our shadow, whether it be the collective shadow, which is the government, or which is, you know, the lower astral. There's a collective shadow that we all share. And then there's our personal shadow. Whenever we look into that shadow, we're always going to find something that resonates with us on some level. So we have to know how to use shadow to reflect to us what we need to heal or what we need to discover, rather than have it use us. And that's, I think, an initiation that you're right about, that we have to do.
I like that. And since you mentioned money controllers, I can't help but point out, and this is for a later episode, but my latest X discovery in relation to the monetary system is the 1917 dollar, which before we had all the fancy stuff that we have now, that was the 1917 dollar with an X right emblazoned on the back of it. Very, very unusual design. Something we're going to point out. We're going to get to the last two questions.
Okay.
But before we get into that, I want to remind everyone you're watching Dark Journalist. And I want you to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter there. That's the way that we stay in touch. And it's also the best possible way for us to continue to stay in touch, knowing the kind of unstable action that there is on these social media platforms. Make sure that you get that connection going, that pipeline going back and forth. And so we'll send you basically that newsletter once a week to let you know what shows are coming on. And that's crucial, though, because it's the kind of thing where, it feels to me at some point there's, as we see that kind of crackdown going on in social media, it comes around and it comes around. So we'll always hope for the best. One thing I want to point out about Gigi, I have to say this with a smile, Gigi is fantastic at picking up on things that I'm working on when I give her questions, and often will give me up an answer just before I get to the thing I want to ask her question about. And one of those cases happened when you pointed out to me when you were looking at something relating to the Hall of Records in Egypt, and you were talking about these sphinxes where their heads lit up at the top.
Yeah.
And so I was kicking around in a totally different end of the spectrum, and I was getting into what Mary Shelley's husband, Percy, and what he was into. And he had written a whole incredible book on Rosicrucianism. And the cover of his book used this famous Rosicrucian image. And I did send this over to you, but I want to show everyone. Here are the sphinxes with the lights coming off their heads here. There's one, there's another one. And here's this very, very unusual setup of this strange Rosicrucian ritual that's happening there. And there's no doubt it's the, summoning of the beyond and all the rest of it. But, that's just the kind of thing that happens with you, which is you really, I never thought of sphinxes with lights in their head. I was like, I wonder what that's all about. And boom, here it is right in the middle of this different end of the research. So that happens a lot with you, Gigi. And you pointed out the pillars in that image, which I thought was fascinating. Oddly enough, I pointed out on this show those two same pillars, and this is an interesting drawing by Rudolf Steiner relating to those pillars, J and B. And there's the red pill, blue pill imagery that we got in the Matrix and all the rest. So I find that whole kind of combination of things coming out of the Rosicrucians through Steiner's work informing so much of the kind of stranger things. We say, oh, you've been red pilled or whatever. In fact, you've been red pillared by Steiner's work a century ago. This is, I think, what he was getting at with this 100-year cycle.
Definitely. I didn't realize that was so
derivative.
Yeah.
I was blown away, by the way, with the Sphinx with the light up heads, because I remember thinking and writing down, I've never run across Sphinx with lit up heads before. This was interesting. So that's a very, that in a nutshell, that's the kind of incredible perception that you have. Miss Olivia, two questions.
Okay, all right. Well, I want to give a shout out to a cult fan.
Okay, cult fan.
Whose birthday is tomorrow,
hey.
Which is Hobbit Day. And,
Hobbit's Day?
Hobbit Day, yes.
Okay.
And which is also Bilbo and Frodo Baggins' birthday.
There's tons of Lord of the Rings stuff going on today.
Yeah, it's amazing. And a cult fan is a great friend of the show, and I am a big fan of his.
Shall I do my Samwise
no, please do not.
impression?
Anyway, so a cult fan's question is, would you please ask Gigi if people born on the cross quarters, solstices, and equinoxes, in her experience, is there anything about them she finds unique about those 4 days for birth?
Yeah, I think that there would be. I think that it's such a significant time. And what I'm getting right now is that I think it's a magnifier. So I think it would magnify. I don't think that you could look for any one quality, but I think it would magnify certain qualities.
That makes perfect sense.
That's what I would say.
Wow. Last question.
Okay,
Miss
last
Olivia.
question, JJK. What does Gigi feel about our future? Will we have some good come into our world?
Oh no! Oh dear.
Sorry, she can't answer that. No comments. No comments.
You know what? I'm actually, anytime that I've looked in, I've always seen growth and I've always seen light. And I view this situation as being necessary. What we're going through is a purging. Everything that we're talking about was going on 20 years ago and 30 years ago. It's just that we were eating TV dinners and watching Dancing with the Stars and we didn't realize it. So this is good. We are in a time where we get to see everything that's going on, and that means that we can make better choices, and that means that we get more growth. And we're in a great time, and we have to look for reasons to be grateful and reasons for it to be, because there's always going to be a choice. You can view it as being a horrible time where we're being sort of always victim to domineering energy, and that is true. But it's also true that you can tap into your higher self and you can start functioning from a higher octave. And that's what these situations really call for, is we are creating our reality now based on what we think and feel. If you can be grateful more, and it sounds cheesy, but loving more, and in that higher octave more, you will notice in your life different opportunities. You will notice different things in front of you day to day. You will feel differently. You'll be inspired to have different conversations. So we are designed to follow where our thoughts are and where our emotions are. And so remember that you're always in control. And no psychic can ever really tell you that, what's going to happen for you, because you're always creating it. And that's the truth.
Fascinating. It is fascinating. Your best bet in life is yourself. Wow, incredible.
I mean, I've had days where I'm super anxious and low, and I suddenly have no energy. I'm noticing everything negative around me, and I don't want to, do anything. But if I can manage to switch my energy that day and exercise and maybe eat a little bit better and whatever, suddenly I get a great creative idea, and I make a YouTube video and I book a client. And so there really is this. It really does come down to your future. It does come down to where your energy is and where your consciousness is. And it's so important to know that.
Wow, incredible. Gigi Young, amazing, amazing work. An incredible ally for the work we're doing on the X series. I really appreciate everything that you do. Your new series is an intuitive training series, and everyone should go to gigiyoung.com to find out more about that. We're going to have Gigi back on, as she's really been helping the series move along, and with incredible insights that I'm always impressed by. So it's fantastic to have you here, and thanks so much for coming.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for watching.
Wow. Miss Olivia, you have the word of the night.
I'm starving. Let's go eat.
That would do it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I see great people out there, and it's fantastic. We will see you next week with episode 28 of the X series, and it's gonna go deep. Somebody said Samwise. There he goes.
They want to hear it. They think they want to hear it.
Maybe next time. I'll be ready for you next time. David Donaway is out there. Fantastic stuff. Mythmaker, thank you so much for joining us tonight. A great crowd, and incredible work that Gigi has done, and bringing forward the work of Ada Lovelace, I think is quite crucial when we consider the X series, the Orphic Circle, Emma Britton, and then we consider their scientific push, what they were looking for, the ideals they had, and what we've actually got in what we described tonight with CERN, which I think we went deeply into, but we're fair to say that it's, the technology around CERN is a neutral thing, and I don't think we engaged in too much superstitious conversation about CERN, but we got right to the heart of the very kind of occult mystery of CERN, which is, it's actually quite unusual. So there's no question about that. And I don't think that, you know, the kind of secrecy serves that organization. And if anything, it just makes people more curious. So here we come. We will see you next week on Friday at 7 p.m. for episode 28. Sign up at darkjournalist.com for the newsletter. Get behind the series. Subscribe to the series. Subscribe at darkjournalist.com. That stuff's available for you. You get more. There's incredible interviews and things you're going to want to be a member for. So make sure you get on board. We will see you next week. And Miss Olivia, what's for dinner, by the way?
It's going to be pizza again. Definitely pizza now. Big, maybe 2 glasses of lemonade.
Lemonade.
It's hot under these lights.
Here we go. Fantastic. Gigi, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gigi.
Thank you, Olivia. We'll chat later about Egypt.
Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
And we will see you all next week.
Thanks, everybody.
Gracias, senoritas.
Let's eat.